Dr. McGill. Dr. McGill is currently an assistant professor of school psychology at the College of William & Mary, where he's been since 2016. He's both a school psychologist as well as a behavior analyst and a BCBA. According to his vita, he was also a substitute teacher and a school counseling intern. And so I think we can clearly infer that school psychology is the best of all of those professions. Dr. McGill did his graduate work in California, earning a PhD in school psychology from Chapman University. I will also share, for those of us in Anne Arundel County, that Dr. McGill told me that for undergrad, he was recruited to play baseball at the Naval Academy, and he strongly considered it. While we are sorry he ended up in California, we are extremely grateful he did not go to West Point. Dr. McGill is a prolific researcher and writer. His areas of interest are related to assessment instruments and measurement issues, including theoretical structures of cognitive instruments, validity of both instruments and assessment approaches, and the clinical uses of assessment approaches. When I looked at his vita, it seemed to me that Dr. McGill is really asking the question, what do these cognitive instruments really measure, and how should we best use them? Dr. McGill's article, Cognitive Profile Analysis in School Psychology, History, Issues, and Continued Concerns, was the 2018 School Psychology Article of the Year for the Journal of School Psychology. We have given you copies, and I assume Dr. McGill will autograph them at the end if you'd like. Dr. McGill has many other accomplishments on his vita, but I would like to end with talking about his generosity. When we originally approached Dr. McGill to come and present, we were intending to write an MSBA mini grant for next school year so that we could compensate him for coming all the way to us and presenting. Dr. McGill told us that he would happily come for free because he felt that it was his ethical obligation to share this information and the current science with us. So I have to say, in an ever-increasingly cynical world, we are so in awe of Dr. McGill and his work and his generosity for being here. So without further ado, please let me join us in welcoming Dr. McGill.
I first want to kind of start off and kind of give a little bit of background. I often get asked where my interest in SLD assessment really started. I didn't actually start off in terms of thinking about becoming a researcher when I was a practitioner and making that transition, thinking that I was going to do some kind of a research strand on specific learning disability assessment. As Kelly was saying, if you look at my CV, the vast majority of my work and really my principal focus is in the applied validity of intelligence tests. And so we were looking at the structural validity of tests, the predictive validity of tests, and as we started to do that research and see similar results, it occurred to me that this had implications for the applied use of these tests vis-a-vis SLD assessment. And so that's when I first really started playing around with this idea. And I was actually asked in my last semester at Chapman before I made the transition to go to Texas Women's University, where I was at before I got to William & Mary. I was asked to teach a new course on SLD assessment that was developed at Chapman because of how important that particular area of assessment is for school psychology. As we're going to see, the surveys continue to show, obviously this is different from jurisdiction to jurisdiction, but we're still approximately 30 to 40% of our referrals on average have to do with academic dysfunction. And that's pretty much held steady over the course of the last 25 years. And so at Chapman, we thought, given how much and how big of a role that played in Southern California, it would behoove us if we actually had a standalone course in that area. So I taught it. I had to develop the curriculum all by myself. And so really the first part of this presentation was really my foray into the history of SLD as a construct and early attempts to try and identify it going all the way back to the 60s. And I found the history was really interesting because I started to recognize really, really quickly that, as Kelly indicated, these things are becoming controversial. They have always been controversial. These same debates that we're having today, we were having at the very inception of PL 94-142. And you can actually see historically where there was a separation between various camps that I will try to make that linkage today, and I will argue to you has created the sort of tribalism that we have today in school psychology. It actually has its roots going all the way back to the 70s. And we'll talk about why that is. So I think the history is really interesting as practitioners to really understand where do these models come from, what are the assumptions, and what are the debates that we've been having really since the beginning of trying to unpackage this idea of how do we figure out which kids have SLD and which kids don't. So that was kind of my interest in it, and so I taught the class. And then something happened in the spring of 2014 in California. We were a die-in-the-wool discrepancy model state. There had been attempts to try and move forward with RTI. That was not successful. There was pockets of RTI in California, but pretty much 85% of districts were doing straight-up discrepancy model. And then all of a sudden, someone forwarded me, to this day, I don't remember the email, I wish I did, but they forwarded me a draft of a white paper. And that white paper would eventually become a white paper that was authored by the California Association of School Psychologists, basically endorsing moving to a PSW model of SLD identification. And I wasn't too shocked, knowing CASP, that they were eventually going to go in this direction. What troubled me was, I saw some of the assertions that were made in the white paper, and obviously at this point, I was aware of research that kind of countered some of that stuff, but I wasn't shocked to see that not referenced. What really kind of got me going down this path that has led to today was what was connected to that email chain. And it became clear that it was the internal communications of the ad hoc working group that had produced it. And I noticed that one of them happened to be from Pearson. And that was never disclosed to any of the CASP membership or any of the people that saw the white paper. And I thought, that's interesting. Representatives from test companies working behind the scenes to draft these kind of documents that benefit their companies. So my big thing is about conflicts of interest, and we'll kind of talk about some of those things where I've seen them. It's not so much that we automatically assume these ideas are wrong because someone may have a conflict of interest, but I think it should be concerning to us, it's the lack of disclosure, right? So that's something I always try to point out to people in terms of when you go to these workshops and you see these things, are people actually saying these things? And when people do the conflict of interest disclosures freely, I always say, good on them. They don't have to do that. So that's a little bit of my background. So we want to talk today about just sort of how we got here before we get into the various models. So I probably have more material than we're going to be able to cover in 3 hours, even though I talk really fast and can go through stuff fast. So we'll try and augment. Some of this I think will be review for many of you. Some of you folks, this may be the first time you're hearing about this stuff in terms of the history. So I'll try and pace it as we go along. So I want to spend most of the time kind of talking about, in particular, new stuff that's emerging about contemporary models. And then obviously, I don't just leave you without a solution. Talk to you about if I ran the world, what would I like to see happen? Which is probably never going to be the case. And then hopefully leave as much time as we can for Q&A at the end. I'm totally fine answering questions as we go. I would just ask in terms of like the content, the time spacing, if it's something to kind of wait till the end, just use your clinical judgment on that so we can kind of get through some stuff. But I want to state at the very onset, these are very complex issues, right? We've been trying to figure out how to diagnose SLD for well over 30 years now. And there is no consensus about how to do that, okay? So these are, in many cases, value-laden issues, depending on our training, depending on our experience, depending on our theoretical orientation. So oftentimes we enter into this foray. In some cases, it's reminiscent of bringing data to a faith fight. And so, I'm open to other ideas. I don't have any investment in any particular PSW methodology. Frankly, I could care less. If the evidence comes out tomorrow that PSW works, I will be teaching it to my kids on Monday. And we'll totally write a mea culpa with some of the stuff that I've written about it. So I don't make tests. I don't do software. I don't get any kind of royalties from PSW stuff. So I have to state that at the onset. This is just my read on the literature and presenting you guys what I hope to be objective information so that you guys can use moving forward however you guys wish. So I'm an assessment guy. So for me, the big thing is it's not necessarily what I believe or what I think makes intuitive sense to me. I'm guided by the data. So a good friend of mine, Gary Canavay, always kind of talks about the importance of psychometric standards and understanding that. Why? Because it gives me some guideposts in terms of what things have to be in place for us to do certain things. So like I said just a little bit ago, I'm not predisposed to reject an idea. I have no investment in this. To me, it's all about what are the psychometric standards, what are we being asked to do, and is there data that indicates that we can actually do that, okay? So irregardless of whatever measure or technique we use, we're always going to have to deal with error, right? We learned that in our first introductory measurement class, assessment class, when we were first in training programs, right? I think sometimes, though, we forget about that in practice, because I see a lot of interpretations where it's like, you really question, are they really thinking about error? Like the fact that these scores that we get are not real. They're our best guesses, right? And so any kind of assessment decision-making model, because of the error that's in the tests, is also going to have error in it too. So it's not a matter of trying to find what method is perfect. It's about trying to find the method that reduces error as much as possible, okay? So all of our, as George Box used to say, the famous sort of quip, all models are wrong, some are useful, okay? So I'm a big ethics guy, right? And for those of you that are familiar with the different test standards and codes, all of them basically say that the onus is on the users of tests to use them how they were designed, but more importantly, understanding the limitations in terms of reliability and validity, right? It's not the test publisher's responsibility. We would love them to provide that information, but it's our job to actually be aware when we're using those tests in practice that what are the limitations of their test, and as Wiener said in 1989 in sort of a famous commentary, ethical clinicians, A, know what their tests can do, and B, act accordingly, okay? So this is a kind of a framework that we presented at a PSW symposium at NASP. And it was by my friend Alex Bojan, and I really liked it because we really have to start off by thinking about SLD as a construct. How we do assessment from a scientific perspective, we begin first with the concept. Until we move forward and develop instrumentation or develop methods or start pontificating about theory, we have to be able to delineate what it is that we're actually trying to measure. And this is the central problem with SLD, because we don't have a consensus operational definition. And that's been the thing that has plagued SLD assessment since its inception. So from a scientific perspective, we first begin with defining the concept, then figuring out how to measure that construct, and then we develop instrumentation that aligns with that. In psychology, we actually do it the exact opposite. We don't really define the concept very well. We start off with these measures that we already have, and then we try to fit them into some kind of framework and see. It's like throwing darts at the dartboard when we're blind. Hopefully this model sticks, even though it was not necessarily designed to do this, right? So think about the IQ test. The IQ test was designed well before LD was a construct. It was not designed for the purposes of LD identification, okay? We are now trying to work backwards and take the instrumentation and then fit it to a concept that we then develop. And we'll talk about the ramifications for that. So thinking about a scientific approach to measurement, thinking about this sort of linkage will give us some insight kind of starting off into what the real problem is, okay? So like I said before, this is recent data from a survey that was much needed in our field. I got tired of citing the Pfeiffer study from 2000. It's like 20 years old. Someone needs to go and actually survey school psychologists and see what they're actually spending their time doing. And so these were, I believe it was close to 2,000 practicing school psychologists, a nationwide sample. These were the referral concerns for clinical assessments. And as you can see, specific learning disability, if you combine the next two categories together, it almost equals what we're getting for SLD. So there's been a little bit of a reduction in SLD incidence rate over the course of the last 10 years, but it still, by far and away, is the #1 referral concern in terms of clinical assessment. Like I said, that varies by locality. I was speaking in Richmond the other day, and a psychologist stood up, and she's like, "Oh, I never assess SLD. All I do is assess autism." Well, she had a very unique cluster of kids, so I think this applies to most folks, but there is some freedom to vary. So first, let's get into kind of the history. So where does LD come from? There have been really two major strands that kind of converge together to create this construct, right? So the first one is this sort of biomedical orientation that emerged out of early research and case studies that was done on war veterans from World War I that really formed the basis of foundational neuroscience. This idea that individuals would come back from war with traumatic brain injury, and then they would have these very focal cognitive deficits. And so that research line was really what prompted our understanding of language networks, but understanding focal deficits according to insult in the brain. And then, but out of that, really the emphasis is on classification, right? I'm trying to figure out who has the thing and trying to figure out a biomarker that I can use to figure out as a gold standard for diagnostic criteria. The other are social and political influences, right? Think about what was happening in the 60s that was going on in terms of equity and different things that we were dealing with as a country. All of a sudden, that is part of not just the civil rights movement, but the disability rights movement. And so those forces came together and said, we need to create protections for children that have disabilities in public school systems. And so out of that was this idea that we need to create this omnibus legislation that led to PL 94-142. And so those two strands together were coming together to create this idea of defining what we now refer to as a learning disability, okay? Both of these strands continue to influence the field in different ways, Okay? So we have the basic foundational research that's being done in terms of trying to understand the neurobiological mechanisms behind LD, but we're also coming together today and having conversations about how do we adequately identify these kids, how do we protect these kids, how do we intervene with these kids, how do we tweak our local regulations to meet those charges. The other thing we have to keep in mind, I went to a talk back in, I think, 2008. It was a neuroscience conference, and I had the opportunity to hear Deborah Weber speak from Harvard Medical School. And she talked about this idea that we have to keep in mind as we're thinking about LD from an evolutionary perspective. This is a relatively new phenomenon in our species history, okay? Because of the demand changes over the course of the lifespan that now have a heavy emphasis on reading, right? This is really only a century-old idea. And so again, if you think about from an evolutionary perspective how the brain has developed, we're asking kids to do things that in terms of an evolutionary species history perspective is a relatively new thing, okay? And so that you get this uneven development. She talked about, you have to remember that what you're asking kids to do from a cognitive perspective is actually incredibly complex, recruiting all kinds of neural networks, okay? So, as I talked about before, the early influences really started with just sort of this basic sort of foundational neuroscience research where folks like Franz Gall were trying to figure out, they had these patients who had these weird cognitive deficits, and most of them had to do with language and speech. And they were trying to figure out what area of the brain was impacted that was causing this, that was different in these case studies compared to normal controls. And so at that time, they had a very robust population of World War I veterans coming back with concussive injuries, with traumatic brain injury. They developed lesioning in various areas of the cortex, and then folks in the medical profession started to notice that these individuals had these sort of unique, weird language deficits that they then attributed to those insults in the brain. And so basically from this line of research, we get the idea of basically localizing dysfunction to focal areas of the brain. That is, if you have a lesion in a specific area of the brain, once I know what function that area of the cortex controls or is responsible for, I can then expect that there's going to be a deficit in the observable characteristics associated with that function, okay? And out of this, we actually get our sort of early understanding of language networks. So Broca and Wernicke's area, their work with selective aphasia, we started to theorize about how different areas of the cortex work together to produce speech and also the understanding of language. Now, some of this stuff turns out we were a little bit off, but a lot of Broca and Wernicke's work is actually held up over time, okay? So part of that, we understand the localization of psychological processes, the idea that language is produced in specific areas of the brain that are different than, say, visual perception. But we also started to understand how the two hemispheres communicate and produce language and the understanding of comprehension of speech. So this is Broca's area, and this is Wernicke's area. And the idea behind their sort of early theory is that this being at the intersection of the motor strip and the frontal lobe was really involved in speech production, controlling the movements of the mouth. As you think about what you want to say, the fact that I'm thinking of the words that I want to say and they're just coming out, my mouth is actually seeing them, and I see by nodding of your heads something I'm saying is intelligible. Well, that is Wernicke's area, right? Located at the intersection of the angular gyrus, which is really sort of the upper level regions of the temporal lobe, or temporal lobe, which is involved with understanding of language, language stores, comprehension. And like I said, so we understand, they sort of approach as separate sort of systems. We now know that they work in concert a lot more than was originally thought. But for folks kind of just doing one-shot case studies, pretty remarkable given that they didn't have the technology that we have, nothing even close to that. So then where does kind of this idea of LD came from? Learning disabilities occurred many, many decades prior to our actual formal authorization of LD in terms of like special education legislation. We just didn't refer to it as such. So early in the late 1800s, we had this idea of what people were calling word blindness. For whatever reason, you would put printed text in front of adults and children, and they were just not able to produce the lexical aspect of reading. It was almost blind to them. That was what it appeared to be. It didn't matter what they did, with intact language ability. So it was just specific to reading. And so Berlin was the first one who actually coined the term dyslexia, and that was based on 6 case studies of adults who lost the ability to read, what was thought due to a focal brain injury, but retained intact overall language skills. And so we're getting this idea that dyslexia, reading disability, is really something very focal without global deficits to language. Orton comes along and he kind of hypothesizes, he starts adding some of this visual motor types of aspects to trying to understand how words are decoded. And he's really the first one that kind of comes along and says, I think that word blindness, dyslexia, whatever we're calling it, that one of the hallmark symptoms of it is letter reversals, right? So this idea that we're still battling today about letter reversals being dyslexia, that's where it actually comes from. You have to understand that Orton, as we'll talk about later in terms of his intervention strategies, he was really one of the first people that came along and said, we have to go beyond simply teaching kids, phonics and having them read text, but really doing motor perceptual types of tasks. And so his belief is that dyslexia was caused by multiple causes. One of them could be just some kind of focal language deficit in the brain in terms of understanding the phonological structure of language. Part of it was also not being able to visually process the stimuli that was in front of you. And so this idea of letter reversals would be these mixed wiring or this mixed wiring in the brain. And so actually what he did with his intervention modus was he was thinking of doing different perceptual tasks, but in his head, the goal was to rewire the brain and get rid of those missed cross signals, okay? And so then somewhere in the literature in the mid-century, we get this idea of, this is really minimal brain dysfunction, undefined, right? We don't really know what's going on, but there's something going on. It's weird. This is not to the level of intellectual disability. This is not a global deficit, but there's just something going on in these kids' brains that's just a little bit off. And then obviously most of us know at this point the term learning disability is actually first coined by Samuel Kirk in a speech that he gave to what became the Learning Disabilities Association of America in 1963. Interesting cocktail party knowledge. He actually used the term learning disabilities in his textbook. How many of you had to read Kirk's textbook in graduate school? I had to. It's still around. He's no longer with us, but the book is still around. It's still one of the foundational textbooks called Educating Exceptional Children. I think it's now in its 22nd edition or something, so those royalties are really nice. But he actually mentioned it in '62 in that textbook, but no one really picked up on it. So, out of this early influences, there is some consensus, okay? So by the early 20th century, there was evidence enough to accumulate to indicate that we weren't calling it LD, but what are we calling it? Word blindness, dyslexia. This was something different than other neurological disorders, okay? This was not a constellation symptom of some other disorder. This was something unique in and of itself, okay? We believed that it was some form of congenital learning problem. It was acquired during development. It was not the result of, say, injury or TBI. Someone didn't hit these kids in the head and all of a sudden they couldn't read. This was something they were born with, okay? The disorder tends to affect more males than females. That's still true today. The disorder was heterogeneous in nature. Kids could have a reading disability. We weren't really focused on math at that point yet, but they could have different types of symptoms, right? So even today, we still have this concept of what is reading disability. It could be a comprehension deficit. It could be a phonics deficit. It could be a word retrieval deficit. It could be a fluency deficit. It could be a deficit in acquired knowledge and vocabulary, right? But we did think it had something to do with these sort of language systems that were being developed at that time. Our understanding of the interrelation between Broca and Wernicke's area. There was something going on in that interaction. But again, remember, we don't have fMRIs at that time. We can't go and look at the brain, even at a very functional foundational level. Now we can actually see, I don't know if anybody saw this, I saw this on Facebook the other day, they had actually done a time lapse to where they can actually look at individual neurons connecting to each other now in real time. This is a new technology, right? We never thought we'd ever be able to get to that point where we can actually see a neuron fire and actually connect to another neuron and form these synapses and these dense neural networks that basically form the basis of thought. They were not working with that technology at the time. So a lot of it was very just sort of intuitive stuff, but it wasn't all wrong. Also the idea that, these kids are going to need more help than you typically provide in a normal classroom. They're going to need some kind of intervention. This isn't just going to sort itself out over time. You're going to have to do something on top of regular instruction with these kids to recoup some of these deficits, okay? As I said before, there was a disproportionate focus on reading dysfunction, okay? Because that was the number one observable characteristic of these kids in terms of what was unique. These kids couldn't read despite getting instruction in reading. And I would argue after I had to write a learning disabilities treatment chapter, and one of the things that we talked about was, even today, I would say 75% of the LD literature continues to be disproportionately focused on reading. We have no clue what to do with kids with math problems. Don't even get me started on writing. We looked at the interventions and we're like, I told the editor, he's like, your writing section is like 5 pages long. I'm like, well, outside of strategy instruction, I couldn't find anything, right? So we're still in that stage today. The good news is we know a lot about what to do with reading, but we'll talk about that gap when we talk about issues with RTI, okay? And at that time, we're like, this is gonna be a consistent theme for today. We think we've got something. We think it's this unique thing. We don't really know what it is yet, but we have no way to reliably identify it. That will come later. There was literally no effort at that time beyond simply kind of thinking about, hey, we got these kids, they're kind of weird, we think there's something unique going on. There were no attempts to figure out how would I distinguish whatever it is that I think I'm seeing here from garden variety poor learners or even other disorders, okay? So basically it was largely based on exclusionary criteria. And this is where we get this idea of, basically in all our models, there's no rule-in test for LD. Okay? We're basically saying you don't have this, you don't have this, you don't have this, you don't have this, and at some level I go, what else could it be? And that's something we're still doing today. So this is what it means. You hear this term in the literature a lot. I'm sure you're all smarter than I was. It took me about 10 years to kind of figure out what the hell these people were talking about when I said, we're diagnosing LD by exclusionary criteria. This is it. It's not this, it's not that, it's not that, it's not that, and eventually I have to say, therefore it must be this. So it's not intellectual disability. It's not result of poor instruction. It's not lack of exposure to English. It's not ADHD. Therefore it must be SLD. Okay? And part of that was because most of the work that was done early on was really just focused on remediation. We've got these kids, we need to treat them. So how do we intervene? How do we get results with these kids? How do we develop curriculum that can help these children? Okay. So we developed early methods like the Fernald method. He was an early adopter of sort of this like multi-sensory approach to intervention. He coined the term the VAKT method, the VAKT method, the idea that you're going to train students who have reading difficulties and visual, auditory, kinesthetic, and tactile sensations. This idea that you're training multiple neural pathways, you're going to foster learning. This is also where we really got the idea of whole word instruction, right? Whole word instruction being the idea that you see this visual stimulus, and once you learn to rapidly sort of decode that automatically, that it will foster just sort of comprehension skills, right? And here's the crazy thing, right? Why we have these debates, right? How many of you guys were around during the whole language versus phonics wars, okay? Those are some rough times. And to some extent, we're still having those debates today. Okay? But this is the thing that confounds reading intervention for kids that struggle. 75% of the kids, it doesn't matter how you teach them. They'll figure it out, right? You can put them in whole word, you can put them in phonics, they'll get it. It's that other 25% that's the problem, right? Those are the kids we're dealing with. They need evidence-based instruction. They need certain types of modalities stimulated because the brain's not doing it automatically, okay? I don't know about you. I was a pretty good reader growing up. I don't remember my mom ever sitting me down and going over phonics. You know what my mom did? She said, here's a book. Read. Like it was just supposed to like happen. Like I would sit there for an hour and I would stare at these pages, and then through osmosis, like I would just start to like, utter intelligible text. Well, it worked somehow. Right? But if I was a kid that couldn't do that, I would probably need explicit phonics instruction. you would have to tell my brain how to do that, okay? We already talked about Orton-Gillingham approach. This is the idea of mixed dominance. I talked about this sort of misfiring in the brain. They really believe what was at the root of that was the lateral firing. Like, right, the right hemisphere was doing things the left hemisphere was supposed to do, and the left hemisphere was doing things the right hemisphere was supposed to do, and you needed to do types of remediation that would essentially ferret all that mixed dominance out, okay? But out of this, we got this idea of explicit phonics instruction, right? So it wasn't all bad. I want to call attention to someone that we don't often talk about in this lineage, Marion Monroe. Okay? Marion Monroe was one of the first to actually look at and say, if you really want to understand how to intervene with these kids that struggle to read, you should probably look at the errors they're making when they're reading. This is in the 30s, folks. She was doing error analysis in the 30s. She would sit down with kids, she would have them read, and she'd say, man, that's a phonics-based deficit. Or you've got a comprehension deficit here. So we're going to work on these specific things. She also developed what was termed a reading index. And this was actually the early roots of an early variant of the discrepancy model. She said, you give the kid, once you figure out what they're weak at, you give them a reading task they can do. So if they've got a phonics deficit and they've got intact language skills, I'll give them more general language tests. And the idea is that I'm seeing that there's a discrepancy between some of the strengths that they have in other areas versus the specific areas of reading that they struggle with. And she was kind of playing around with this idea that if you saw a big enough difference, the discrepancy, that would indicate whether or not this kid had a disability or not, okay? And then came Samuel Kirk. And in addition to founding the LD construct, he's also famous for developing the Illinois test of psycholinguistic abilities, the ITPA. How many of you heard of the ITPA? Oh, thank you, some of you. The ITPA was famous in its time, and once Kirk championed LD as a construct and things started to take off, he immediately pivoted to, we've got to figure out how to help these kids. But his approach was really the beginnings of this focus on individual differences. And so what he actually wanted to do was he wanted to create an instrument that you could use to assess strengths and weaknesses in a kid's psycholinguistic profile, and then use that to match the kid to certain treatments. And he did this under the auspices of his scholarly work at the University of Illinois. So it was a huge hub for learning disability research, and in particular ITPA research. And so basically he had this special school filled with kids that had learning disabilities, what we then referred to as learning disabilities, and kids that had intellectual disability. And Kirk just went in there and he gave them a bunch of ITPAs, and he developed individual profiles, and he started doing instruction, trying to figure out if I could match certain types of instruction and remediation to particular profiles and get positive results. So this was essentially the beginning of the aptitude by treatment interaction movement, ATIs. This idea that I could figure out, I could match some kind of intervention to your aptitude profile. And on the basis of that aptitude profile, if I didn't match that, I would not get good results. If I match it, I'm going to get better results, right? And then William Cruikshank was really kind of the first one to take that a next step and really talk specifically about, really at the root of this is a deficit in information processing, okay? Now this is before the cognitive revolution, it's right on the precipice of it. So I think we have to recognize what's going on there too, right? So right on the precipice of the cognitive revolution, where are folks focusing in terms of where do we go in terms of understanding LD? Cognitive processing, information processing, individual differences, right? Because that was sort of the heavy influence in terms of understanding cognition at the time. So here is Kirk's original definition from his book in 1962. A learning disability refers to a retardation, disorder, or delayed development in one or more of the processes of speech, language, reading, writing, arithmetic, or other school subject resulting from a psychological handicap caused by a possible cerebral dysfunction and or emotional or behavioral disturbance. It is not the result of mental retardation, intellectual disability now, sensory deprivation, or cultural or instructional factors. There are two things that stand out to me about that definition. The first thing is this ambiguity, right? A learning disability refers to something. It could be this, it could be that, it could be that. but we think it's not this, this, and this. Okay? The other is how closely it matches our operational definition today. Hashtag progress. So things get refined a little bit more by Barbara Bateman in 1965. So this is after Kirk's speech in 63. And then the movement starts in our field to really try and operationally define LD. It's like, all right, cat's out of the bag. We said LD, so what does that mean? How are we going to operationally define it? And Bateman adds a little bit of language to basically playing off of Kirk's early definition. And she says, children who have learning disorders are those who manifest an educationally significant discrepancy, emphasis added, between their estimated potential and actual level of performance related to basic disorders in the learning process. And then notice that retains the same exclusionary criteria, but now, all of a sudden, we've got this term, and everyone's like, what does that mean? Discrepancy, okay? So a discrepancy between their estimated potential, we're not necessarily saying IQ, we're saying potential, it could be anything, and actual level of performance. So now the feds get involved, okay? And this is during the mid-60s, and we're on the pathway to PL 94-142. This took about a decade, okay? So efforts to actually create IDEA actually started in the 60s. And the biggest thing was they were trying to figure out what categories are we going to include and how are we going to define them. And one of the major debates was, do we include learning disability? Okay? And so there was a national working group. There were two task forces that was formed. Task Force 1 was mostly filled with medical doctors. And their charge was to come up with an operational definition. So you had Kirk here's kind of an idea, and then Bateman's got this discrepancy thing. And now the feds are like, you've got to actually come up with the one we're going to use. And so this is what they come up with. They totally punt learning disabilities, and they bring back that minimal brain dysfunction. The term minimal brain dysfunction syndrome refers to children of near average, average, or above average general intelligence with certain learning or behavioral disabilities ranging from mild to severe, which are associated with deviations of function of the central nervous system. These deviations may manifest by themselves by various combinations of impairment in perception, conceptualization, language, memory, control of attention, impulse, and motor function. For minimal brain dysfunction syndrome, now we have this new idea that you have to have average or above average or better intelligence. Okay, so they're pulling that out of somewhere. And you're going to have certain behaviors, but we're not going to specify what, ranging from mild to severe, which are associated with deviations, so deficits in central nervous system functioning, undefined. Okay, so not only are we introducing even new amorphous language, but now we're moving to a completely different conceptualization of what we think is LD. We're calling it something different, but now we're saying specifically, you're not LD unless you have average or better intelligence. So Task Force 2 is formed. This task force included primarily educators. And so they really came up with two ideas. So they took Bateman's discrepancy, and so that was really the first step. So kids are LD who have educationally significant discrepancies among their sensory, motor, perceptual, cognitive, academic, or related developmental levels which interfere with the performance of educational tasks. And then the second aspect of it was children with LD are those who manifest an educationally significant between estimated academic potential and actual level of academic functioning. So really, they're focusing specifically on two things. This idea of discrepancy between potential, we're not saying how you measure that, and how you're actually performing. And now we're introducing the concept of impairment, functional impairment. Not only do you have a discrepancy, but you've also got to have some legitimate impact in your educational performance that I can see, okay? So the feds basically played off of that Task Force 2 definition in terms of conceptualizing LD for PL 94-142. So the first omnibus special education bill comes in '66, the Education of the Handicapped Act. There were no protections for kids with LD. And basically, the congressional staff that was charged with drafting that legislation was so concerned with the ambiguous definition of LD And the fact that there was so much uncertainty about what it was and the fact that we had no identification method that was available, they're like, we cannot do this. Because basically, you're going to create a situation where pretty much any kid that's struggling in school academically could qualify for special education protections. So we're not moving forward until you actually define the construct and then tell us how we're actually going to measure it, okay? They then passed a separate bill in '69 called the Children with Specific Learning Disability Act that provided some protections and supplemental funding, but really the major goal was to try and do those things, knowing that they were eventually going to get close to having an IDEA come forward, and if they were going to include learning disabilities as a category, we needed to get some conceptual clarity on these things. What about the DSM? All right, we got to play around with the DSM too. The psychiatrists, DSM, they actually come forward in '68. They did not have learning disability, or what was referred to as specific learning disturbance, as an actual disorder. They listed it as a preliminary clinical condition. So for those of you who've been trained in the DSM, you look at the back of the manual and it's like, these are all the things we might include in future DSMs. We're just kind of like putting it out there to see what people think. That's where they put specific learning disturbance. One of the reasons why, and they listed in their criteria for why they did not want to move forward with having as a category at that time, was because learning difficulties were a constellation symptom of so many different childhood disorders, right? ADHD is actually listed as a disorder in the DSM-2, okay? And so they said that's part of the problem. If you have these attention problems, one of the things you have learning difficulties. If you have various medical ailments, you might have difficulty learning, right? So how do we distinguish this as a separate syndrome when all we have in terms of the things that we see as clinicians, the observable characteristics of the kid? What are the observable characteristics of LD? What do we see when we're assessing the kid? Nothing. We use our magic 8 balls. No soup for you. What does every one of these kids have that we ultimately qualify for LD eligibility? Low achievement, right? That is the common underlying observable characteristic. Well, the problem is that is an observable characteristic that's a constellation symptom of a lot of different disorders. It's also the observable characteristic of kids that are what we refer to as garden variety poor learners. They don't have LD, but they're struggling in school for whatever reason. And this is essentially the problem as we get into the diagnostic models. That is the problem that plagues every single model. We today do not have a single method to be able to distinguish between kids with LD and garden variety poor learners. Okay. So, key elements of early definition. It's this idea that there's something going on in the brain again. We don't necessarily know what. We use different terminology, whether it's processing, cognitive processes, central nervous system dysfunction, right? But all this is a central idea that there's something going on in the brain that's causing this dysfunction. The other is this underachievement is unexpected. So we have to have evidence that this kid is capable of doing more than they're actually doing, okay? But the major focus is on adaptive behavior, not necessarily intelligence. Notice that we have not said anything about intelligence except for Task Force 1 definition. The discrepancy part has really been about focusing on potential as broadly defined, but more importantly, the functional impairment part. What is the kid actually doing in school? And does it rise to the level the way they would need special assistance? The educational impairment, a significant educational impairment, okay? Obviously, we've gone through several of them, and we're still kind of vague about who's LD and who's not. And again, there's no consensus on how to identify. I love this quote. So this is a representative who was on the subcommittee who ended up drafting IDEA and putting it forward. Bill Lehman. No one really knows what a learning disability is. And I suspect not much has changed since. All right. So now we get to PL 94-142 time, the modern era. Okay? This is obviously our first omnibus special education bill that goes live. We're still dealing with its descendants now. It's the first piece of legislation that has formal authority in the schools that recognizes learning disability as a category for protection, okay? And so this is the definition that was ultimately produced. So you have the bill that's passed, and then lobbyists and staffers spend the next 3 years basically saying, what do all these words in this bill actually mean? Okay? And that's really, in terms of, we're at that stage right now where I've heard IDEAs in committee. I don't know what the dysfunction in Washington, if we're ever going to be able to pass something that large, but it's been around for several years now, so I don't know when it's coming. But once it gets passed, it doesn't really mean anything to us until those regulations are written. Because the regulations are basically, this is how we're going to operationalize all of these statutes, okay? And that's really where the sausage is made. So this is from the U.S. Office of Education in 77. These are final regulations for PL 94-142. The term specific learning disability means a disorder in one or more of the basic psychological processes involved in understanding or in using language, spoken or written. I'm not going to read it all because it's basically the same definition we have today, right? You see that language, deficit in one or more of the basic psychological processes, okay? But then we have this idea, right? The retention of exclusionary factors. So those are going to play a heavy role in the identification parameters for this condition. Now notice, because this trips people up all the time, and they say, we have to do psychological processing assessment because it says a disorder in one or more of the basic psychological processes. So I went to law school for a misbegotten year of my life. But the one thing I learned, in addition to being 20 grand in debt after a year, was how important in law language is. So for those of you that haven't had the misfortune of going to law school, one of the first things that you do, you're like, okay, I'm coming from undergrad, I'm getting these assignments, I have to read, you basically have to read 20 and 30 cases a day, and you show up to class, you have no idea what they mean, how they all link together, and then your law professor just yells at you, okay? The idea is you're starting to understand how these cases create precedent, and they create new understanding, boundaries for which a judge will look at and say, if this is the issue I have to decide, these are the boundaries by how this has been defined by prior law, okay? Judges can't just go and make things up. They have to look at precedent and say, how has it been decided before? And have they met that standard? But one of the things you learn and you're told in your first day in class is, if you don't understand what the word is, circle it, look it up in Black's Law Dictionary. So I'm like, all right, this is a 3-page case. This is going to be really easy. I get to the first word, the. I did not know the legal definition of the. I had to look up the legal definition of the, circle it, write it down in the margin. So after about 4 hours, I've got literally a page and a half read, and I've got all these definitions, okay? But from that, we understand the limits of what things say and what things don't say. So it does not say that we have to assess these things. What it is saying is, if you diagnose a kid with LD, we assume that it has something to do with a disorder in one or more of the basic psychological processes in the brain. It's inferred by the definition. Does that make sense? Okay? It does not say must. Must is a really important word in the legal terminology. Must means you have to do this. You don't have a choice. May is permissive. So you've heard this one, I'm sure, before. You may use the discrepancy model, right? It doesn't tell us we have to use it. It says we are permitted to if we choose to, okay? So only things that say must are things that we have to do, okay? So all this is saying, and it's kind of like convoluted logic, but as we've seen with the way that we write special education regulations, ED anybody? It doesn't necessarily always make sense. They're saying, look, if you say this kid's SLD, my assumption is there's a disorder in one or more of the basic psychological processes. I don't need to prove that, okay? So now we're starting to look for, okay, we've got this definition. How are we going to identify these kids? And this was the central battle from the time that PL 94-142 was passed in 75 till the final regulations were written in 77. We have not talked about an identification model yet today. We had this idea of a discrepancy model, and the only thing that was available was the study that was done in 75 by Reuter and Ewell called the Isle of Wight study. How many of you heard of the Isle of Wight study? Okay, a couple of us. The rest of us, useless cocktail party knowledge. Go home tonight, talk to your spouse, like, what did you learn today? I learned about the Isle of Wight study. So basically these two psychiatrists in Great Britain, they went to the Isle of Wight. They administered a group of, I believe it was 2,000 kids. I have it written down here. 11,000 kids reading and IQ tests. And they were just basically trying to do an epidemiological study. They weren't trying to prove anything. It was really exploratory. And so they got this really interesting result when they looked at the distribution of the reading scores. And this is not from their study because, I don't know if you guys have read anything before. If you've gone back and looked at a study that was published before, like 1970, it's kind of fascinating and sad at some level. Like, they're like 2 pages long. Maybe they have data, maybe they don't have data, okay? So there's no graph here, but this was roughly the distribution that they got, okay? And so they got this multimodal distribution, and in this first hump they said, these are the normal kids, okay? The vast majority of the 11,000, this is their reading performance, they're fine. Now we get these weird 2 humps at the bottom end of the distribution. And what they said is that first hump, we think, are garden, they use different terminology, but basically garden variety poor learners. And this last hump, these are the LD kids. Anybody want to take a guess at what point in the Gaussian distribution that second hump occurred? How many standard deviations? 2. We got this stuff from somewhere, okay? So they said, let's just put that 2 standard deviation mark, and everybody below that line is LD. And that's where we got the discrepancy, a formal definition of the discrepancy model from. Again, folks, that was the only thing that was available, was just this one study. When the feds moved from defining to how do we assess this, they didn't have any other alternatives. But there are issues with the Isle of Wight study. They did not exclude kids with brain injuries. They did not exclude kids who had intellectual disability. And so it's possible that that second hump was caused by including kids that had really, really low ability. It was an artificial sort of hump that was created through contamination in the sample. But the bigger thing is the 2 hump phenomenon has not been replicated consistently across different samples. So there was another subsequent study that was done in the UK where it was replicated. It was not replicated in Australia, was not replicated in the US, was not replicated again in the UK. So it looks like this was just a spurious finding, okay? And even Reuter and Ewell in the write-up say, this could just be the same group. We could have just got some weird thing here, but these kids could be a part of the same group. All right, so don't take this literally. Well, again, we didn't have anything else to rely on. So folks, yeah, doesn't work. But anyway, the aptitude achievement discrepancy was proposed by the feds. It was actually included in early draft versions of the final regulations. The response from the scientific committee was univocal. This model sucks. There is absolutely no way we can move forward with the discrepancy model as if you've created it. It's psychometrically flawed. It's not likely going to differentiate between kids, garden variety poor learners and kids with LD. We have no evidence of treatment utility. There's nothing there. There's got to be something better. So the other thing was there was also dissatisfaction at that time too with the operational definition, in particular invoking the language a deficit in one or more of the basic psychological processes. Because of the ITPA research that was going on at that time that was producing negative results. And so folks were like, wait a second here, this is an assumption and it's not coming out in the research that understanding cognitive processing is leading to effective treatments for these kids. So there was those 2 things that were principal sources of frustration. And when I say everyone hated the discrepancy model, I mean literally everybody, okay? So the feds go, okay, fine. We're going to give you till 1977 when we have to go live with the federal regulations. That's your drop dead date. And if you don't come up with a better alternative, what do you think we're going to give you? Discrepancy model. So when I presented this in class the other day for my students, I was telling them, it's kind of ironic that how we got the dominant method for LD identification over the last 40 years was as a poison pill plant that failed. So basically, you could imagine everybody hated the discrepancy model, but no one could come up with anything that could replace it. There was no consensus. And so in '77, regulations went live, poison pill option in place, epic fail. We got the discrepancy model through default. And so they basically said, they eliminated the language. They actually had language where they specifically said something like the discrepancy has to be 50% or something less than academic potential. It was actually operationally defined. The feds actually got rid of that and just left the generic discrepancy language, just significant discrepancy, and said, it's up to you states. You guys can operationalize this however you want, okay? But one of the nice things they did, though, because of all the acrimony that was created, is Congress spent a lot of money, and they created federal learning disability institutes across the country. And they said, man, we don't know what the hell we're doing. So we're going to give you a bunch of money, we're going to get the best and the brightest minds, and we're going to say, you got to do two things. Figure out a gold standard identification method, and figure out evidence-based treatments for kids with LDs. And so these learning disability institutes were funded at the University of Kansas, UVA, University of Illinois Chicago, Columbia, and Minnesota Twin Cities. And so when you look at the LD literature, and in particular a lot of the school psych literature, it's not surprising that the vast majority of stuff that's been produced has come from these institutions because of, in that lineage being traced to the federal LD learning institutes, those sites. We'll get back to that in a second. All right, so DSM-3 comes along in 1980. Learning disability is a category now. This is the criteria that I pulled from a PDF that was online. So they call it developmental reading disorder, developmental arithmetic disorder, developmental disorder in language. And basically, they codify the federal language around discrepancy. So not only do you have the feds moving forward with discrepancy, you've got DSM following suit, and they are then codifying discrepancy. So the discrepancy model is really being pushed now from two major perspectives in terms of diagnostic criteria. So what did we learn from those learning disability institutes? Okay? So not only did the US DOE at the time fund these institutes, there was also a lot of funding available from other allied federal agencies like National Institute of Health, OSEP, the Office of Special Education Programs. There was then also the creation of regional resource centers around the country to give technical assistance to folks as they're implementing PL 94-142 as they run into problems. How do you get around some of these things? So, does anybody know who this is, by the way? Such a shame, I get this all the time from students now. This is Jim Yzeldite. He's one of the real OGs of school psychology. If you were looking at stuff in the 70s and 80s, pretty much every other article you come across is like Jim Yzeldite. He was he obviously is retired since then. He was the head of the Learning Disability Institute at the University of Minnesota. And this was written in an article in 85 or 83. But basically what have we learned after 5 years of trying to study this thing? I love this quote. After 5 years of trying, we cannot describe, except with considerable lack of precision, students called LD. We think that LD can best be defined as whatever society wants it to be, needs it be, or will let it be at any point in time. Who have other researchers studied? The 1% of the school-age population, as some experts think are LD, or the 85% of the school-age population other experts think are LD? We think researchers have compiled, this is my favorite one, we think researchers have compiled an interesting set of findings on a group of students who are experiencing academic difficulties who bother their regular classroom teachers and who have been classified by societally sanctioned labelers in order to remove them to the extent possible from the regular education mainstream. It's an overly draconian view, but I suspect that not a whole lot's changed since then, right? He authored a study that I just love. Some of you may have come across it. Anybody familiar with the article called Teachers as Tests? So what he did is he kind of taking off this line, he went and looked at a local school district in Minnesota. He said, okay, who's being referred? How many of those kids are ultimately determined to be eligible for special education? And across districts, it was something like 98% or something like that. It was like 96%. So why the hell do we need a test? Just have the teachers refer. Teachers a test, right? If it's a 96% hit rate, then what are we actually adding to the equation, right? I don't think it's quite that high anymore, but at that time, that's what they were finding. And we'll talk about some of the identification stuff too. But also out of this, you get a different perspective too. I just want to point this out because I think it's a really interesting thought piece by Christine Sleeter, who talks about that sort of socio-political perspective of LD and encourage us to remember what was going on at that time in terms of public schooling, when this idea of creating a construct like LD is coming about. What's going on in public schools in the 60s and in the early 70s? Desegregation, right? It's changing the norms and expectations of school. All of a sudden, schools are having to deal with students they've never had to deal with before. And so her argument is, some parents didn't want their white kids in those special classes with cultural and linguistic minorities. So out of this, we created this label. I'm not saying I necessarily agree with her, but it is an interesting sort of provocative thought experiment. But I do think it kind of raises the idea that we have to think about that we did not have LD until 63, right? So where was it created from? Why was it created from? Where was that impetus for? What problem was it trying to solve? So we've really been dominated from really three major, I'll say two theories. The medical biological model that has its roots going all the way back to those early neuroscientific foundational case studies, okay? And so that's really focusing on LD is really this within child construct. There's something going on in the brain. We have to understand that. That's going to lead us to classification. A major focus of assessment is etiology. The other major focus that's emerged since the Learning Disability Institutes has been the behavioral environmental model. So we got RTI. RTI, as we know it today, was always kind of sitting there. It has its roots in the direct instruction movement, applied behavior analysis. There is nothing new about RTI that was not being done in the 40s and the 50s and the 60s to treat kids with intellectual disabilities. You want a kid to learn something, you operationally define the task, you figure out how to measure it, you teach them, you assess, formative instruction, figure out if it works or not. That's all it is. Then, you do have, I will totally stipulate, some people that have bought into this sort of sociocultural Sleeter model of LD. They don't believe LD exists. And there are some within this RTI movement, we have to be very clear about that, who have been very upfront that they don't believe LD is a legitimate construct. That every kid that we're identifying as LD is an instructional casualty. I don't ascribe to that model of thinking, but we have to understand where that's coming from. That's not necessarily an RTI thing. That's really coming more from the sociocultural model, okay? So this is where the divide comes from, okay? Because that behavioral-based approaches were being championed at places like the University of Kansas, the University of Minnesota. Remember Geiseldyk's quote? So he says, we're never going to be able to do this. So let's figure out what we can do. Low inference assessment, and try to figure out how to treat the kids that need help. That's it. That's all we can do. I don't know whether or not Geiseldyk believes that the LD is real or not. I would probably suggest he doesn't, but I don't want to put words in his mouth. I know folks like Mark Shin have said, I don't believe learning disabilities are real. But that's where they go off in a different direction. And they're taking people with them, okay? And then you've got folks at Columbia and UVA who are convinced that maybe we got it wrong with the ITPA and early ATI stuff, but maybe there's something there. So let's go in that direction, okay? And so they're breaking apart from the field, but they're creating this permanent divide that we're still feeling today. So when you see folks and you see they have a different theoretical orientation from myself, it's really interesting to kind of look at. Are they coming from that behavioral perspective? Are they coming from more of that cognitive processing perspective? The roots of this divide come from the late 70s and those learning disability institutes and the research that was spawned at those institutes and which direction they promoted in the field. Do you think it's a surprise that everybody that comes from the University of Minnesota is an RTI person? Yeah. Everybody that comes from the University of Oregon is an RTI person? Everybody that comes from the University of Kansas is a behavioral RTI person? Because that's the model, the theoretical orientation that's being promoted in those particular institutions. And they're very influential, okay? And then we clearly have folks that are oriented to more of a cognitive processing orientation. And they can't understand why these people believe what they believe. Because we see the world in a completely different lens. And so my argument is, when I hear things like third way methods, like you can't. You can't do it theoretically. If you truly believe in this, you don't believe in this. If you truly believe in this, you don't believe in this. You can't do the two simultaneously. It's a lesson that I was taught in my doctoral program, taking qualitative research. That was a rough year. And my professor, of course, every student wanted to do qualitative because they were afraid of data. So they're like, I'm a qualitative researcher. I'm doing a qualitative dissertation. And so when my professor would ask them, what type of research are you going to do? Everybody said, I'm going to do mixed methods. So mixed methods is a combination of some kind of combination of quant and qual. The idea is it's the best of both worlds, right? And she said, you can't. Mixed methods doesn't work. She was a hardcore qualitative researcher. She said, if you're a qualitative researcher, you're a qualitative researcher. You don't believe in that stuff. You can't combine the two. And I remember this quote to this day. She said, you'll just be bad at both. Okay? And then you had some crazy people who just wanted to stick with the discrepancy model and write it out, right? But obviously, this is where we get a divide. And so we see this happening in the 70s, and you look at it and you go, what are the camps now? PSW, RTI. I don't know, is there anybody that's really championing the discrepancy model? We can have that debate. I'm sure there's one. Out of 1,000 people, you might find one, right? Okay, so now we're getting to the assessment part. So, influence of what happens out of that. And I would argue this was really more of an issue of institutional inertia. Not because we love the discrepancy model. We either weren't satisfied, I kind of believe in PSW or whatever that became. I kind of like RTI, but I'm not really convinced any of them really work. So I'm not going to abandon what we have now until I have a better idea of what the solution is going to be, okay? Which I think is totally defensible, by the way. So from a philosophy of science perspective, if you don't have evidence to know that something is going to be more effective, that it could potentially be worse, inertia is an acceptable response. It is. Because these decisions we make about kids are critically important. And one of the things that I'll talk about at the end is we need to be very careful here. I hear this all the time, Ryan. Well, let's implement X model and then see how it works. We are not an agile organization, folks. We're still dealing with the discrepancy model 40 years later. So if you implement a model and it turns out it's worse, you're going to be dealing with that suck for 40 years. It's just the way education works. That's why we have to get it right. Okay? Okay, so what happens in terms of influence on state criteria? Not surprisingly, by the time, and there was 6 of these studies that were done, they didn't even bother changing the title of the article. They just had, learning disabilities definition and criteria used by state education departments, 86, 90, 96, 97. By the time we get to 90, 98% of states either have discrepancy in the operational definition that's used in their regulations or is explicitly stated as required identification criteria, okay? There was a few folks out there that are doing some weird stuff. We've all seen the case studies, right? Heartland Area Education Agency, they got away with labels. In Minneapolis, they were doing an early variation of RTI, but there really wasn't much in terms of alternatives at that time. So I'm going to talk about the discrepancy model now. rather than embed it later, because I think most of us are familiar with the ills of the discrepancy model, okay? So one of the first things that we started to notice is there were a whole lot of discrepancy models. Which one did you want to use? Grade level deviation, expectancy formulas, standard score methods, simple difference methods. Each one of them has their own strengths and limitations. But more importantly, each one of them is going to identify a separate group of kids, okay? So the most common one that was employed was some kind of simple difference approach. Have IQ, we have achievement. If that difference exceeds an a priori threshold, then you have the LDs. And so you're essentially setting a cut score, whether that's 1 standard deviation, 1.5 standard deviations, or 2 standard deviations. In fact, I think the only one I saw that was like 2 standard deviations was Tennessee. So if you're a school psychologist in Tennessee today, if you assess a kid according to the discrepancy model, if that kid has an IQ of 100, they're not eligible for LD unless they have a score equal to or lower than 70. That's a very conservative threshold, okay? Most folks were anywhere between 1 standard deviation and 1.5. In California, where I hail from, we were 1.5 standard deviations, which equates to how many points? 22.5. Should we round up or round down? Depends on your tolerance for legal issues, right? I always say round down. There were actually 9 states. This is actually kind of surprising, given how much emphasis there was on process assessment. Only 9 states actually added a processing deficit rider to the discrepancy. So in addition to discrepancy, there also has to be some kind of de facto evidence of having a deficit in cognitive processing. I happen to hail from one of those 9 states. It was a living hell. Can you imagine walking into a room with a parent saying, Johnny has a 40-point discrepancy, but I don't have any evidence of a processing deficit, so your kid gets no help, okay? And there is no of those 9 states, none of them provided any kind of concrete definition of what a deficit in processing was. So when I first got out into my internship, I saw all kinds of stuff. Some practitioners would say, is it significantly discrepant from their IQ? Like, so it was like a double discrepancy. You had to have the same discrepancy, 1.5 standard deviations in the processing deficit from IQ as you had from achievement to IQ. Some of them did it, and I would say more correctly, is there a normative deficit? Consistent criteria can apply across people. Do you have a score at or below 85, at or below 90, whatever your threshold is? Some people, we had no idea what the heck they were doing, right? Someone sent me the PowerPoint on PSW here where it's like they were looking at your guys' identification at AACPS and what criteria was used. It was like 26%, we have no idea. That's what it was in California. It was like, well, I'm not seeing any scores below 90. How did this kid have a processing deficit? And they would say things like, oh, well, I watched them qualitatively do this task and it looked like it was difficult for them, right? But again, put your junior lawyer hats on, because I always argue school psychologists, that's part of our job description, right? Is there anything in that regulation that says you can't do that? No, it's not defined. So whatever argument you can make in front of the ALJ hearing under cross-examination, how many of you guys have been under cross-examination before? Okay? It's whatever you can spew that they buy, right? I'll tell this little short story as an aside so we can have a little bit of a break here. I was a practicing school psychologist for 5 years in Newport Beach. My last year, I was actually assigned to the district office for 0.5 my FTE as the high-profile assessment school psychologist. So you can imagine being in a place like Newport Beach, the kind of crap cases that I got, right? So I got cases that were already in litigation or were on their way to going to serious litigation. So in fact, I still have one 5 years later that is still in the US district court system. Thankfully, it does not involve my assessment, so it's kind of fun just to watch that play out. But again, for those of you that haven't testified, you think, okay, it's going to come down to who's doing evidence-based stuff? Not necessarily. It's whoever can tell the best story to the judge and get the judge to believe it, right? If you can convince that judge that the kid needs dolphin therapy in their IEP, true story that actually happened, by the way, okay? So again, we would have these crazy, crazy due process hearings where we get school neuropsych folks and clinical neuropsychologists doing independent evals, and they'd come in just spinning these yarns and looking at subtests, looking at qualitative indicators, and you're sitting there going, I'm trying to do evidence-based assessment here, and it's whoever could tell the story and get the judge to believe them, right? Okay, so simple difference method. The biggest problem with the discrepancy method, regardless of the one you use, is the fact that different scores are inherently unreliable. When we're making decisions in a discrepancy model, we are not evaluating the actual observed scores. We are interpreting the difference score. Does that difference score meet or exceed the established threshold? Okay? There's also regression methods. So I know that they used to use the discrepancy model in Maryland. Did you guys use regression or simple difference? Regression? California had that for a while. The CD actually used to provide tables, and then all the tests got revised, and they're like, screw this. So they just said, hey, we'll add something in the state regulation that says you get plus or minus 4 points standard error of measurement across the board, accounting for error. I don't know what the plus was for, but so again, this is the most psychometrically defensible approach because the correlations between achievement and cognitive tasks are not perfect. The correlation between full-scale IQ and reading is going to be higher than written language, meaning there's a closer association between these two. So I don't necessarily need 23 points for that to be significantly different. I might only need 15. It just depends on what the formula is. The difficulty is I have to know the reliabilities of the indicators I'm using, which we should all know, but I also have to know the correlations. And most states stop publishing guidance, so you have to then hand calculate this stuff. Or if you were just using, like they used to do the WISC and the Wyatt, and they would just publish the forecasted regression tables. And so basically, if you look at the back of some old manuals, you guys will see these, for those of you that aren't used to this method before, they basically take your IQ score and they predict, based on that score, based on the correlation with the achievement, what that threshold should be for that relationship. And if it exceeds that, then you have a significant discrepancy. There's actually a misnomer about this, by the way. I hear this occasionally. They say the regression method controls for regression to the mean. It actually doesn't. Okay? It's simply trying to get a more precise predicted difference depending on the measures you used. Okay. I talked about the reliability difference scores. I'll show you an example of how bad this is. We've got test A, let's call it FSIQ, 0.90, pretty reliable. Test B, insert achievement score, pretty reliable, 0.90. The observed score is 100. For the FSIQ, the observed score for the achievement is 77, so I have a 23-point difference. I'm in California because this is my presentation, so we're in my state. 1.5 standard deviations, have I met that? Yes. So I say the kid has SLD. Let's assume we don't have the processing thing. The correlation between test A and test B is 0.75. That's really high, okay? Really high. Even in those conditions, the reliability of the difference score will only be 0.60. And those are fairly optimistic conditions. Think about if you have an index score on a cognitive test, 0.85, 0.87, we start to attenuate reliability. God forbid you use a writing test. Have you seen the reliabilities on those? They're like 0.6, 0.4. But how many of you guys use the WJ4? If you've seen the WJ4 printout, the confidence intervals for writing tests, it's like 4 to 99, or like 140. It's like your kid could have a real big problem here. They could be gifted savant. We don't really know. So calculate a 95% confidence interval for that difference score, because that's really all we can say with all of our tests. As I said before, that observed score is a fiction. All we can say, the only level of precision we have with our tests is the confidence interval. That is all you can say to a parent when they ask you a question. So if they're low average to average on FSIQ, all you can really say is your kid's low average to average. That's it. My advisor used to say that's all you should be reporting. He's probably right from a psychometric perspective. I tried that, by the way, as an intern. It went horribly. So think about if we have this cut score, 1.5 standard deviations, 23 points. At the observed level, we've met it. Now take that confidence interval and apply it there. What decision can we truly make about that kid? We have no way to determine whether or not they're above or below that threshold when that confidence interval strands that cut point. So now we get that issue with the discrepancy method, but then there starts to become a line of research looking at the treatment utility of the discrepancy model, and in some aspects, the treatment utility of cognitive testing. How many of you are familiar with this Velutino article, 96? It made the rounds a lot when RTI was being disseminated. I have some issues with it now that I actually can read it and understand it, but it was taken as de facto evidence that cognitive assessment really wasn't useful for treatment, right? And there's some evidence to indicate that, although I'd say it's much more limited than we thought it was at the time. But basically, they gave Wechsler tests to all these kids. They were having trouble in schools. They did reading interventions with them, and guess what? Cognitive correlates did not predict reading intervention response. It didn't determine who benefited and who didn't. And so from that, we start to get this line of what eventually became modern RTI research, okay? This is one of my favorite articles in the history of school psychology. For those of you, it's available on ResearchGate right now. It's free PDF. Peterson and Shin. They wanted to look at what actually explains who's identified with learning disabilities in schools. What model? Like we've got the discrepancy model, we've got different things, but let's go in and actually look at the data and say what model actually fits these data for this school district. Okay? So they looked at discrepancy model. This is a discrepancy model district. And there was something like 40% of the kids that were identified in special or for SLD, it didn't fit them. They were not captured by that model. So we're like, okay, it's not discrepancy. Folks are doing something else here. The only model that fit the data well was what they refer to as the relative achievement discrepancy. That is that if you took the bottom 20% of kids, you took the distribution of academic performance in every school, and you took the bottom 20%, that would capture the vast majority of kids that are identified for special education. Now here's the kicker. It doesn't matter what your performance level for your school is. So when I was in Newport Beach, my first school district was Newport Coast Elementary School, down the street from Kobe Bryant's house. We literally had the help pick their kids up in the parents' Maseratis. You know how many of our kids out of 440 were below benchmark in reading on state tests? 5. So I went to my principal and he was like all into RTI, and I was into RTI at that time too, and he's like, I want to do RTI. I'm like, Dwayne, we don't need to do RTI. We already know who the 5 kids are, right? Just go help them, right? So, you know how many LD referrals I got that year? Exact same proportion I got every single year. At my other sites, I came from an internship where I was at 90% ESL Title I school. Same proportion of assessments, right? And that's essentially what this relative achievement discrepancy is talking about. And for those of us, I say, look, if you've been a school psychologist long enough, you know exactly what this means. Because this is it, right? What happens when you D&Q a kid? See him the next year. D&Q a kid again. See him again the next year. Until eventually you cave because of the social pressure, or the kid magically catches a learning disability that year, right? And this is why when we go in and do those audit studies, we have objective criteria, right? Discrepancy model, folks. Adding and subtracting, okay? It's not complicated. But we find that when we go in and we apply that criteria, and this was replicated during the 90s in every district in the country where it was looked at, only 25% of kids on average met criteria for LD eligibility based on the state regulations. Because that's what's going on. So my argument to you is, we know this. This is going to go on no matter what model we have. We're going to get pressure because of the social expectations of that school site, right? How does it go over when you try to tell the teacher that, you know what, this is a high-performing school on a national basis, this kid is okay? Doesn't go over well, right? You don't know what you're talking about, okay? So we have to understand that limitation, and my argument is our models have to understand that limitation too, okay? Because this is going to go on no matter what model we have, right? So when we did the discrepancy model, for those of you that actually had to do it, school psychologists, after a couple years, you get really adept at being able to play on the margins, right? Kid doesn't qualify, give him a C, Tony. Give him this test. Give him that achievement test. I can get 23 points. I can get almost any kid to qualify under the discrepancy model after a couple years experience and knowing my measures, right? We're very adept at that. We're very skilled. It's like prison, right? We learn all these weird skills. So when we think about some of the potential limitations of PSW where we have even more freedom and even more discrepancies to look at, my suspicion is when we do these audit studies in 10 years for those that have implemented it, we're going to see even more variation in terms of like, man, because you can qualify anybody in some of these models, right? Okay. So there are strengths of the discrepancy model, albeit very few. It's relatively easy to implement, okay? Simple addition and subtraction. It's more kind of acting as an actuarial model, right? It's not asking us to really think a whole lot. Plug in the numbers, is there a difference? Do I have any kind of weird stuff going on? No? Okay, fine. They meet criteria. It's an intuitive approach, you know. We're trying to figure out how to operationalize unexpected underachievement. It might make sense we would do this, okay? And since interpretation in most cases is limited to FSIQ, we're interpreting the most reliable and valid score on a cognitive test, so we're on good, firm ground there. Problems. We've already talked about a lot of these, so I won't, for the sake of time, belabor them. The biggest one, it's a weight to fail model. Kids come in kindergarten and first grade, they have not failed enough to have a significant discrepancy. This is why it's really important to understand your achievement measures. I understand most of you don't do achievement testing. Good for you. I didn't either, but I have districts and divisions in Virginia where school psychs do all of it. I'm like, get the heck out of that division. Okay? But understand what is being measured by your achievement test, because you're getting those scores, you need to know the limitations. And one of the big limitations is there are floor effects at young ages on every single area of the achievement test. It's like the SAT, folks. You write your name on it and you get 800 points. Okay? It's like that for kids in kindergarten and first grade. There's just not enough content at that level of the test to distinguish between kids. So you get these kids and it's like, well, they got an average score, they only did 3 items, they hit their ceiling, there's not enough of a discrepancy there. But you get the kid back 3 years later, now they failed enough. Now we have item content. Now we can discriminate. And so now we start to see the differences emerge, okay? So that's the biggest problem. In the actuarial studies that were done, you want to know what age most kids with SLD were identifying the discrepancy model? What grade? Third. Vast majority. Significant. And believe you me, these kids were being referred in kindergarten, first, and second. Probably being assessed multiple times during that period too. But by the time they get to the end of second and third grade, they have enough of a discrepancy to qualify. And what we've learned from the intervention research, right, is you've got to get in and help those kids before grade 3. You intervene after grade 5, no chance. Not saying you can't help them. I'm just saying you get decreasing marginal returns. No, it doesn't matter how intensive the intervention is. There's not enough time to catch up. So that weight to fail is dooming some of these kids. You're not getting until 3rd grade. The curriculum changes after 3rd, right? Reading to learn versus learning to read. And you're working with them on phonics for the first time, okay? There's other issues that under-identifies kids with low IQ because of regression of the mean, right? You have this really, really high IQ score. I get achievement that's likely going to come down, okay? So I'm not getting enough of a discrepancy there. The stability of discrepancies sucks. Poor discrimination between LD and garden variety poor achievers. That's no different than the other model. We talked about it doesn't discriminate between children who benefit from intervention. You know the one I love is the fact that it is based on the myth of cognitive referencing. Does anybody know what cognitive referencing is? You heard that term? Okay. Speech language pathologists use it, right? Because they outright ban it. They're a professional organization. You cannot just D&Q a kid from speech because of their cognitive score. You can't use that as a forecast for their potential for speech and language services, but yet we do for the discrepancy model, right? So all of this coalesces in the end of the 90s. Everyone's still upset about it, but now we've got all this research showing it's just terrible. Practitioners have been doing this for 20 years, and there is this sort of crescendo finally that reaches an apex point to where we're finally going to get some kind of change, an alternative to the discrepancy model. And that comes in the form of the LD Summit that was held by Congress in 2001. This book was one I read to prepare for that class that I developed. So what happened at this LD Summit is basically Congress got all of the experts in LD across the country. They said, hey, we're going to take everybody. Everyone is an expert in LD. Come and write a white paper. Tell us what we should do. There was responses to the white papers. There was debate. And they just had these hearings over the course of 2 weeks. And they said, what alternatives should we use? What are the problems? What do we need to identify? Because IDEA is coming up for reauthorization in 2001, and this is our time to really have a solution to this, okay? We hear that most of you don't like the discrepancy model. Let's come up with an alternative. So this book really gives you some insight. It contains all of the white papers that were presented at the LD Summit, and they're organized in terms of how they were argued, who responded to what. And it's really interesting to see what was debated and what was contested and what was argued in those hearings, okay? But basically, that summit produced the guidance that then led to the changes in IDEA 2001, okay? So in IDEA, we get the first RTI language. It still allows for a discrepancy model, right? May use discrepancy, but you are no longer required to use discrepancy. And then things get a little bit amorphous with respect to profiles of strengths and weaknesses. As we'll talk about in a second, there's some amorphous language in IDEA that says something to the effect of a kid can have LD if they have strengths and weaknesses and blah, 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 everything. And folks are like, what does that mean? Is that a new model or is that just general language? And then there's also even more amorphous language that says states have the ability to adopt a alternative research-based criteria as undefined. They don't say what research-based means, okay? So, I don't know what just happened there. So this is the state of where we stand now, right? We've got technically you've got 3 provisional models, at least that's the consensus, and you've got amorphous language that basically indicates an infinite number of plausible models you could come up with, right, that are research-based, okay? So we've really been, since then, in this kind of state of trying to search for clarification. Now, what was the purpose of this? You had discrepancy, we were looking for an alternative, we wanted guidance. And what did the feds give us? 6 different models to play from, okay? Remember we talked about the inertia problem, okay? So here's what I'm gonna tell a story about what happened in California. So what caused a big scene was, okay, we've got this RTI thing. Do we have to do RTI? Are we required to do RTI? Can we even do discrepancy model anymore? Districts and divisions had no clue. Because most states, like Maryland, carbon copied the federal regulations and just said, we're adopting these. Some states did some different modifications, but for the most part, every state just said, we're going to take that language, we're going to carbon copy it. So then what did that do? That put the onus on districts to figure out at the local level what they were going to do. Okay? So in California, people were petitioning the CDE. They say, give us guidance on how we adopt a model of identification, given that we have a menu of choices. And the CDE, as it's wont to do, said, we're going to punt on that. We're going to leave it up to your SELPA, your Special Education Local Planning Area. Whatever the SELPA agrees, that is your criteria for everyone within that jurisdiction. So districts are not allowed just to go their own way unless they have enough students in their own SELPA. And I think it's around 23,000 you had to have to be your own SELPA. So if you were your own SELPA, life was good. If you were Desert Mountain SELPA with 13 different school districts, life was not so good. Because you had to get everyone at that table to agree to some kind of new model and how they were going to implement it, right? And the whole idea behind the SELPAs in California is you've got kids that are moving around locally from district to district. We don't want Johnny to be in District A. They move 2 blocks over, and we use a completely different method of identification. All of a sudden, now you don't have LD. You're not in special ed anymore, okay? So predictably, you could imagine what happened. Most districts decided to keep the discrepancy model, business as usual. There were a few pockets of RTI implementation, mostly around UC Riverside, because that was a heavy RTI school. So their graduates were going out and they were implementing these things in internships and doing consulting. But outside of that, nothing. Nothing changed. Paradigm shift it was not. Okay. So since then, this is the most recent update on state classification criteria. We've seen, predictably, a lot of variation. So we talked about in 1990, virtually everybody was doing discrepancy model. As of now, this is from 2013. I would argue there's probably even more PSW. Only 67% now explicitly require discrepancy. 16% now have language that encourages RTI. And as of then, it was 14 states whose primary classification criteria was some kind of PSW model. I would argue that's probably gone up. Okay, I think we're at around, there was another paper that's in the revision process right now. I think we're up to 23 for PSW. Okay, so with PSW, as we kind of segue into the models, just remember, there's still about half the states that don't allow you to do anything related to that. Okay, and then a DSM-5 comes along and just throws a wrench into everything. Have any of you read the LD language in the DSM-5? Man, I got out right when 504 was starting to become a thing. I don't know what we would do now, right? I would tell parents right now, screw SPED, go to 504. The language is not well defined. Districts don't have a good idea of how not to qualify kids under this. And by the way, we learned through a very unfortunate due process hearing, your kids can actually get SPED through 504. It's whatever you have available at your school site. It's just not called SPED for them. So again, the parameters of 504 are getting expanded because no one knows what it is. So dyslexia, dyscalculia, dysgraphia, they try to move away from that lineage, although then they say you can still use those terms, but it is impairment in reading, impairment in writing, impairment in mathematics. But essentially in the DSM, it's a dual deficit model. You have a normative deficit in achievement. We tried to do stuff with you and it didn't work. And you got it before age 18. And it's not due to exclusionary factors. That's it. There is no explicit requirement for RTI, although there is vague language that indicates that. Like you tried to do something with the kid and it was not effective. I don't know what that looks like. Put them in a resource room for a couple weeks and they don't learn how to read. Okay. Learning disability. So it really does, remember, before this, DSM is what? So what was the DSM for? What was the criteria in the DSM for eligibility for SLD? We're really taxing the long-term stores now. Discrepancy model. So this is a major step back, and this was met with a lot of criticism. A lot of criticism. Because they say, wait a second here, you've basically just gone to a low achievement model. This is going to create havoc, okay? The other thing is, this now departs from most school-based criteria. So you can have a kid, if any of you had a kid that came in with a DSM SLD diagnosis, okay? And if it's based on this, really low bar. And if you're implementing any kind of formal model, even if you're implementing RTI, I would say the bar is higher in a school-based setting than it is here. And so then that creates all kinds of implications for 504. All right, RTI. Now we'll get to the assessment stuff. Do we want to take a little bit of a break? I've actually done better on time than I've wanted, so we're going to take a 10, 15-minute break. Okay, I think most of us at this point have a very good sense of what RTI is from a conceptual level, so I'm not going to belabor the point here and go over all this point by point. But the major thing that I always try to emphasize for people is that RTI is really just a resource allocation system. Okay, it was never designed to be an LD identification model. Some folks have co-opted RTI after it became disseminated and tried to use it for that purpose. But again, think of that whole measurement, conceptual to measurement to instrumentation. It's a huge problem with RTI because that's not what it was designed to do. But it's like, hey, we've got this triangle model out there that has some assessment embedded into it. Maybe we try to fit it to be an LD identification model. We already talked about where RTI came from. It really has its roots in a precision teaching movement, ABA. There were problem-solving academic intervention models in Iowa and Minnesota long before RTI became the vogue thing in the late 90s. I don't know about you, but I'm kind of tired of all the triangle stuff. I have like weird memories from my graduate program. I used to make this joke that one day you weren't going to be able to do like toilet training without coming up with like a 3-tier model for that. But the idea is that the vast majority of kids obviously are benefited by Tier 1 general education instruction. And obviously, these are not approximate or proportions that we should expect. But if we see anything that grossly deviates from that, it means we've got a problem at that tier that we need to fix. And if we don't fix it, you're going to get overwhelmed at the next tier. Okay? So the 3 principles of RTI: screening, intervening, progress monitoring. If you are not doing those 3 things, you are not doing RTI. So my aforementioned principal calls me in. He's like, Ryan, I know you're an RTI guy. I was at the time. I led the first RTI pilot project in my county's history, which was a very gratifying yet horribly traumatic experience, having to deal with all the institutional inertia that I had to deal with. I remember I was sitting in a meeting one time and I had like 3 people that were on board with me. 1 special education teacher, 1 gen ed teacher, and most importantly, the principal. And we couldn't get anybody else to help with the interventions. And so I called an RTI researcher and I was like, I'm struggling, I don't know what to do. I can't get anybody on board. I won't repeat the actual curse word that he said, but sometimes you just have to do it yourself. And so I did, and we got good results, and we actually brought it to scale. Then, of course, predictably when I left, the model went away. So I get to Newport Coast, and my principal's like, Ryan, we want to do an RTI model, or we do RTI and we want to have you help us refine it. I said, well, what are you using for universal screening? And he said, we don't universally screen. And I'm like, you're not doing RTI. And I bring that point up whenever I talk about RTI because I think all of us agree RTI is a good idea on a conceptual level. It's the implementation part that's hard. And unfortunately, RTI has been bastardized by general education across the country to where folks are saying they're doing RTI, but they're really not doing RTI. They're missing some of these critical elements. And even if they do have these provisional elements in place, one of the biggest things that we're seeing in terms of implementation problems is the lack of intensity in intervention. Okay? So there's 2 dominant methods: standard protocol, problem solving. I don't have any data on this, but intuitively I would say, just waving my magic finger in the air, probably something close to 85% of folks who are doing RTI are probably doing some kind of standard protocol model. So in standard protocol, Every student gets the same treatment at Tier 2. If you have Tier 3, it's likely going to look very similar. We're using usually packaged treatment programs. They come in to get the specialized reading intervention program for 2 or 3 times a week, progress monitor that. And it's not to say that canned programs aren't bad. There's some really good ones, like Voyager's a really good one. It's hitting all 5 of the major areas that the reading panel identified. Just know that you're kind of giving a kind of diluted treatment there where you're only getting access to specific aspects of reading performance. And so if you've got a phonics-based deficit, maybe that's only being hit in that program 10 to 20% of the time, okay? In fact, I think Voyager, if my memory is correct, actually has percentages of how it's allocated towards the big 5 areas, okay? So standard protocol is good in the sense that it provides a mechanism for creating consistency in terms of what we're doing with kids. So it's easy for us to go in and say, I should expect to see this at Tier 2, I should expect to see this steps of the intervention, and I can see if treatment integrity is in place. So a lot less ambiguity. The problem is that if kids don't respond to those interventions, we really have no way of knowing whether it's because we got the wrong intervention match part or because there really is something wrong in terms of intensity, or maybe this kid has a learning disability, it doesn't matter what we do with them, they're going to struggle, okay? The problem-solving method, if you talk to any diehard RTI person, they will say this is what RTI should be, okay? We don't use standard protocol. Every kid is individualized. When they get to Tier 2, we're trying to figure out what is the problem, what do we have available to help that kid, how do we match an intervention to that problem. So every kid's different. And even the sort of neo-behavioral expressions of a problem-solving model, your progress monitoring is individualized, okay? So from an ecological validity perspective, the problem-solving model is better. But you can imagine difficult to standardize when you're doing something different potentially with every kid. I don't know about you guys, but I've never worked at a school that had that many resources to where we can literally sit down as a problem-solving team and say, how do we help this kid? And we've got everything available to meet every single academic need, okay? So there's a reason why schools default to the standard protocol mode, because it's just a resource allocation problem, okay? So there's a lot of misconceptions with RTI. One is that if you're doing RTI, all you're evaluating, if you're using it as some kind of SLD process, is CBM data. That's not true. I don't know of anybody who's actually doing a robust RTI program to where the comprehensive assessment is just CBM data. That is one part of it, okay? It's just not clear what that looks like. What does the rest of the comprehensive assessment look like? Does it include a measure of cognitive ability? Some people are adamantly against that. Some people are open to it. Does it include rating skills? Probably. Observations, records reviews, additional achievement testing, okay? So one of the things that, in terms of getting into these models, every model requires a comprehensive assessment. Really frustrates me when I see people use that as sort of a dog whistle for coded language that comprehensive assessment equals giving 5 hours of cognitive tests. That's not true. Does anybody know what the legal definition for what constitutes a comprehensive assessment is? The actual language is, which you will be judged by? Huh? No. It doesn't say how many tests you have to give. It doesn't say what you have to assess. Assess all areas of suspected disability. That's it. You'll see the judges, and it's really instructive to go and look through fair hearing decisions because you see how they structure, how they evaluate an assessment case. They just simply say, did you assess in all areas of suspected disability? Based on what you knew at the time, did you tailor your assessment to hit all these areas? That's it. Doesn't say you have to give 2 measures of an area. Doesn't even say you have to give any type of test. Okay? The other one is I get a lot now still is, if we implement RTI, Ryan, our profession's going to go away. Seriously, I get emails and see the Facebook threads. It's like, you're ruining our profession if you take away our cognitive tests. I know that's a threat. What I've actually found in personal experience is it's actually the opposite. when you actually step out and start doing and showcasing the full range of our skills, your stakeholders actually start to see how valuable you actually are. The number one thing I got when I was implementing RTI, I think, is we never knew the school psychologist could do any of this stuff. We didn't know you did anything other than sit in your office and just give tests. And here's the really cool thing. But it's hard though, right? I realized very, very quickly when I started doing that, I didn't know a whole lot about the school and school psychology. I knew a lot about giving tests and interpreting profile analysis, but I did not know a whole lot of, I've got a kid that has a reading deficit, how am I actually going to intervene with this kid and make a difference? I needed to learn about the scientific process of reading. I need to learn about reading curriculum. And when you do that, by the way, there's some really cool conversations you can start to have with your teachers. And when they see you can start talking on their level, you guys can work together to solve a lot of different problems. I got news for you guys. If you haven't figured it out yet, they think we don't know what we're talking about most of the time, right? You're this weird person that gives all these cognitive tests, and I just throw the intervention assessment report away, right? How many times have I been told, I've never even looked at your assessment report, right? But here's the really cool thing. And I'm not minimizing how difficult that transition is for some people. They will start to protect your time. When we started getting referrals, my teachers started pushing back on them because they did not want me to go back to the previous gatekeeping role because they saw what I could do in terms of intervention and helping the whole school out, okay? So I actually think it's the opposite. I think we actually can defend our full range of skills, okay? Actually, I think someone said the other day, what was the comment? It was like, if you take away our cognitive tests, and first of all, I'm not saying take away cognitive tests, but that was what this person got out of it, that you're gonna ruin our profession, or we're not gonna be able to employ a school psychologist. And I just responded, I said, if all you can do is assessment, you're gonna be the one that unemploys yourself, okay? So again, major point, RTI was not developed as an SLD identification method, okay? So if you're doing RTI, so when I first got into my doctoral program, my emphasis on RTI was on decision making. There were too many people playing around that intervention sandbox. I was like, there's no way for me to compete there. So I was interested at the very onset of how do we make decisions in RTI, okay? So one of the things that obviously stands to reason is if you're doing RTI and you're sitting there and you look at this data, we need to have some objective criteria about how we're going to determine whether or not a kid is responding appropriately to treatment or not. When does it become inadequate response? And there was surprisingly not a lot of guidance at that time, okay? So we have to consider their level of performance relative to their peer group. What is our target goal for the student? Are they moving towards that target? If they're moving towards that target, we also have to look at, from a means difference perspective, they may be making progress, but man, this kid is never going to catch up to grade level. So maybe we make the decision to put them in tier 3 even though they're benefiting from the treatment, right? So there's a bunch of different methods. There's goal line approaches, but goal lines are just really about assessing learning rate. How well does this kid change their rate of learning? They have this rate of learning when we get them, we do stuff with them. What's their rate of learning now? Have I improved it? Have I made them more efficient? Fuchs and colleagues, they came up with the double deficit hypothesis, this idea that a kid is not benefiting if they have inadequate response in terms of their learning rate, as well as their overall level of performance compared to benchmarks, okay? Most folks are just doing kind of individual growth goal approaches based on expected growth, right? We have those growth tables and we say, I'm working with Johnny, I've done my baseline testing. Where can I expect him to be if he's making what research has demonstrated is appropriate progress from this intervention 6 weeks from now? And I plot that. And then 3 data points below, 6 data points below, those were conventional guidelines we were taught. Then we have to make a decision. If the kid's below, we move them to tier 3. If we have tier 3, if not, we might just jump to a comprehensive assessment for special education eligibility. We actually did some work looking at single case effect sizes. Went absolutely nowhere. Trying to figure out, is there a level of effect we can assess to say this is an effective intervention or not? So Like any assessment approach, RTI has assumptions, right? Reliability and validity of the progress monitoring tools we're using. Since we're making decisions based on trend lines, those trend lines have to be stable. We actually did what we said we were going to do. We actually did something with the kid. And we did it at a level of intensity that was likely to produce change. And even if we do that, we have to get the intervention match right. Otherwise, we can't make any conclusions from the data. If we got the wrong intervention match, I can't say anything in terms of why that kid didn't respond. What was the why behind it? Because if it's an intervention match problem, then it's likely on a learning disability. And we'd like to think we were making consistent decisions across settings, but obviously that hasn't happened. So what have we learned since the halcyon days of RTI, 2005, 2006? Oh, well, it turns out those CBM passages have a lot more error than we think that they do at the time. For some reason, we thought, yeah, I'm observing a kid reading, it is what it is. It's not that complicated. Well, there's a tremendous amount of passage variability. How many of you guys have given the dibbles systematically before? What you end up getting is bounces all up and down, and predictably, you can figure out which passage is going to occur. In my Tier 2 intervention group, all of my ELO kids had the same, they may have different levels in terms of where they were performing, but they had the same dips, peaks, and valleys depending on passage variability because of the requirement that they have background knowledge to read the passages. Which is why if you're doing progress monitoring, I always recommend Ames Web. It's narrative text. You don't tend to see that much variability. Okay? Slope and trend line variance is substantial until you get to about 12 to 15 data points. 18 data points is recommended for stable decision making. Whoa, 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 whoa. We were taught 6. It really turns out it was 18. Now the good news behind that, for all you going, oh my God, I'm never progress monitoring again. It's 18 total. It doesn't mean you have to do 1 a week. So you can give 2 or 3 a week, but when you get to that 18 point after several weeks, your trend line does, so think of a trend line as having confidence intervals around the slope. And so as you get to 18, you're shrinking those. So that trend that you're interpreting is relatively stable. If you're at 6 data points, you can't have any firm conclusions about the kid, about whether the intervention is working or not. Okay? Establishing growth rates is actually more difficult than we thought. I was relying on like the Tyndall tables from like 2002. Guess what? Those fluency metrics have been blown away. Why? What did we do during that time? We started teaching fluency to kids, and they started blowing it out of the water. So the normative growth rates just were null and void after 3 years because of curriculum changes. So this is why I like things like Ames Web to where they're continually updating their norms as they get data from you, so the growth rates in the norm tables are just constantly being updated. But if you really want to do the best approach, you would go and make your own growth rates and norms for your own site. Those would have the most ecological validity. Okay? Interestingly enough, folks like Chris Riley Tillman and Matt Burns were actually, and I give them a lot of credit for this because they were huge RTI proponents. They actually came out in 2008, 2009, and they said, because of these measurement issues and decision-making issues and conceptual issues and inconsistency with robust implementation, we cannot recommend using RTI as a standalone eligibility model at this time. Until you fix that, this isn't going to work. This is 2008. Threats to acceptable RTI-based assessment practice include the lack of research-based interventions, appropriate for diverse academic domains, and students with limited English proficiency. Uncertainty regarding how to determine when non-response to intervention warrants a referral for an evaluation. Difficulty translating scientifically sound practices into local schools. Said in 2008. And so some of us were saying this is a good idea, but we need to get these things right. I'll save this, but here's actual data from my pilot project, right? And the whole idea is, how do you evaluate these data? It's a heck of a lot harder than you think. I train graduate students how to do this, and it takes 2 units just to get them to a point where they even understand how to apply single case logic. And I bet if I could replicate this research study we published, if I asked, is this kid making expected growth, probably 60% of you just looking at the graph and doing the interocular eye test would say yes. You wouldn't look at the fact that there's trend already there in the baseline, tremendous variability, how many of the data points actually exceed baseline points. It's tough. So, as a result of RTI implementation, OSEP produced a report in 2017. SLD still remains the largest eligibility classification, 41% of all kids in SPED still. Okay? There was really no significant impact on disproportionality as a result of, since we've implemented RTI. Remember, that was a huge goal, right? You implement RTI, we're going to have an impact on disproportionality, that's going to solve it. Really no impact. Identification rates really have not changed, okay? So there have been some issues that have been identified, in particular that IES report, which we'll get to in a second. And as a result, people have been saying, we got to go in a different direction. We need another alternative. And so over the last 5 years, PSW has really gained a lot of traction. So the question is, does RTI work? I don't really know. This report is often passed around by various folks who have their own commercial interests, and they say, RTI doesn't work, see? There is some troubling stuff in this report. How many of you guys have seen this reference before, this IES study that was done? It's basically an assessment of RTI implementation practices. They did try to do some work looking at effectiveness, but because of the data they had access to, they were really limited in what they could do. So one of the things, to me, the biggest takeaway is they found that implementation really sucks. There's very few places that are really doing intensive interventions at Tier 2. Most of it is put the kid in for once a week, 30 minutes, they're doing Voyager, they come back out, maybe we're progress monitoring, maybe we're not, and that's it. That's woefully insufficient for kids that are struggling with reading. You know how many, by the way, and I'll say this, one of the limitations is we were not very clear with people about how intensive you needed to be to remediate kids that we suspected of having learning disabilities, of having reading problems. So a lot of the studies that were cited at that time were studies from like the University of Toronto and the Hospital for Sick Kids. You know how many hours of intervention they got to get the results they got? 30 plus. These kids were basically going after school and getting multiple hours of intervention. And one of the things you see with the intervention effect sizes for academic problems is when you start dipping below that level of intensity, those effect sizes go poof. So they did what's called a regression discontinuity design. They basically took kids that were right at the threshold of needing Tier 2, and they compared them to kids that were right above the threshold for needing Tier 2 as a kind of control, right? And basically these kids that were just below the threshold or just above the threshold, that were ostensibly getting Tier 2, they didn't get better in the aggregate. So the problems with that is it's not accounting for Tier 3. It's not accounting for all the kids in Tier 2. The major issue is RTI was not really designed to help kids that are right at the margins of not needing help. So really the question is, what are the kids that are down here that are really at risk? How are they responding? The problem is they couldn't assess that. There's no way you can control for that, okay? So even they said, do not take this as a referendum on RTI. It's very limited in scope. This is about all we can do right now. Okay. So look, I'm going to be very clear about RTI. When it's done well, it works. We have plenty of data to show that when you go in and you have access to resources and you get this buy-in, that's huge too, because it's about a shifting in mindset. This thing produces net benefits across the board for schools. Okay? Here's the problem. It's really hard. And I don't think we were very clear with people about how hard this was going to be. I think we underestimated how difficult implementation was going to be at scale. So we've got these pockets where these models work really, really well, where these researchers have come in and nurtured these things for years. But then trying to take that model to scale at a district level is really difficult unless you have buy-in from multiple stakeholders who are truly committed to changing this thing. I don't know about you, but it's really difficult to get everyone to buy into something no matter what it is in a public school. There's always going to be some holdout, okay? So, our models for reading fluency are really good. But when we start getting to higher level academic skills, not so much, okay? And the predictive effects of fluency as a progress monitoring measure dip after third grade. I think the biggest thing is folks are saying they're doing RTI and they really don't understand what it is. They're not committed to it. So we have issues with treatment fidelity. We have issues with appropriate level of intensity across the board. And again, can't underestimate this enough. I believe in this stuff, but I'm not going to sit there and blow smoke up your new and say it's easy. It's hard. It's going to take years. If you decide I want to do RTI at my school site next year, you need to think small and take a 5-year lens. Build everything from scale, and I don't think that was communicated a lot in literature. So a lot of folks went out there and they were like, I'm gung-ho about RTI, and they tried, and they're like, man, this is way more difficult than I thought. Or they started cutting corners. And so we end up getting these models that just aren't very robust, okay? The research based on interventions is still, in my view, underdeveloped outside of reading. There's been a little bit of traction on math, hardly anything on writing. What about other areas of eligibility? Man, if you could come up with behavioral RTI, there was millions of dollars to be had at the federal level. They tried so hard to come up. You know, one of the problems that plagues behavioral RTI, we don't have a general outcome measure for behavior. So that's one of the principles for progress monitoring and screening, right? I have to have a general measure that can be used rapidly, validly, and measures incremental change. And that's sensitive to growth. Fluency does that. It's great. The scale's infinite. The kid can read as many words as infinitely possible. Really precise scale of measurement. Can't do that for behavior. They tried to take those rating scales and say, we're just going to take 5 items. Think about that. 5 items on a Likert scale. We're going to create a whole scale of measurement from that. There's too much gaps. You're not going to have sensitivity there. So what you end up getting if you had the misfortune of ever giving those, do you guys do the behavioral progress monitoring rating scales with teachers? Teachers loved it, by the way, when you had to have them fill out like the best every week for a kid. And what you end up getting is problem, 3 weeks later, no problem. That's it. You really only use it for pre-post. So they abandoned that. So we don't know about, okay, if we're really going to do this, you're really going to almost have this separate model that exists for reading and then have business as usual for all these other areas. All right, PSW. I'm saying at the very beginning, for those of you that are true believers. Again, I want to emphasize, I was taught all this stuff, okay? I didn't go to some like training program where like the secret oracle behind the scenes that was telling me all this assessment knowledge that other people didn't get. The majority of my work is actually an extension of me being a practitioner. When I got out into practice and I had questions about assessment, so I was like, hey, I could actually go research that and try to figure out an answer. Like, does scatter matter? Turns out, couldn't find any research on it. There was ways to actually study that, okay? So all of this stuff, I was never really directly interested in PSW or SLD identification. It really grew out of my work with cognitive assessment and understanding the limitations of our measures. Okay, so PSW conceptual model. Kids got cognitive achievement strengths, and these are discrepant from some area of cognitive weakness and an achievement weakness, and there's some kind of consistency between those weaknesses. That's it. There's numerous models out there. That's their conceptual framework, okay? They're all the same. So the question arises, PSW allowed in the current regulations. We talked about the amorphous language before. This is yours from the Code of Maryland Regulations. Exhibits a pattern of strengths and weaknesses of performance, achievement, or both, relative to age, state-approved grade level standards, or intellectual development. Does that require cognitive PSW? Nope. I was just consulting with folks in South Carolina, and they were furious. They're like, Ryan, we don't want to do PSW, but then we have the same language in our regs, and we don't know what to do, and we're developing a model. I'm like, you could do academic PSW. It doesn't even say you have to give a cognitive test. It says or both. There's a pattern of strengths and weaknesses. you can basically assess anything, okay? So the feds actually stated, in terms of this language, so folks started to point to that language in the federal regulations, and they said, see, cognitive PSW is allowed. Personally, I think the feds made a mistake. They let that language in. They didn't realize what kind of Pandora's box they were going to open. And so they try to walk that back in the commentary in the federal. They're like, no, we did not mean, inter-individual cognitive strengths and weaknesses. I did not find that persuasive. But they tried to walk it back. So then the PSW proponents started pointing to that alternative research-based criteria as their justification for that they can use it. And again, that's so broad that it's like, hey, what constitutes research-based? There's no definition for that. Okay? So yes, I would argue it is allowed in current regulations. So PSW methods are not new. We have been prophesying various permutations, signs, scatter, profiles for LD identification and cognitive tests going all the way back to the 60s. Do I have anybody still around that remembers the Bannatyne profile, the acid profile, the SCAD profile? I see a lot of the young kids looking around going, what the hell is he talking about? These are all subtest configurations on the Wechsler scales that were prophesized as indicating a person had LD. So acid, arithmetic, coding, information, and digit span. If you had low scores on those subtests relative to other subtests, that was taken as a potential diagnostic indicator of LD. A lot of these come from intelligent testing, from Kaufman, okay? So pretty much every diagnostic utility study that's looked at all these patterns has found that they discriminate LD at chance levels, okay? There's too many kids that have those weird profiles that also don't have academic problems. Ergo, there is error in our measurement, and we cannot use it as a valid sign at the level of the individual, okay? So basically, this is around the mid-90s when kind of all this stuff kind of comes to a head, and basically every one of these patterns and profiles was basically dismissed. It's like, can't use it validly to diagnose LD, okay? So let's understand, we're gonna talk about diagnostic utility a little bit here, okay? To me, this is the brass tacks, right? I can do a factor analysis, but all I care about as a practitioner is, can I use this sign at the level of the individual with the kid when I see it and conclude they have the thing? That's what it comes down to. Group studies are singularly insufficient. We see weird patterns in group studies between LD and non-LD kids. But that doesn't mean I could use that weird pattern at the level of the individual. I have to do an additional step, and that's diagnostic utility. Okay, so when we make a decision, we can decide to cast a wide net. I want to capture as many of the kids as possible. We have to understand that when we do that, we talked about error. There's always a decision that has to be made. Where am I going to cut the line? What type of error am I going to find acceptable? There's nothing that's going to be perfect here. So when I cast, so first of all, we understand when we're identifying SLD, we got LD in normal kids, there's going to be a lot of overlap between those groups. And I can minimize or extend that overlap depending on where I put the decision-making threshold, okay? So if I cast a wide net, I want to get every kid that has potentially LD, right? I'm going to get a bunch of kids, but I'm also going to capture all the kids that probably have LD, but I'm also going to capture a lot of kids that don't. So I'm going to have a lot of false positives. On the other hand, we can be really, really conservative. I don't want to be wrong with my positive test at all. So I make it very, very conservative. And so I'm going to capture far less of the LD kids relative to the total population, but most of my decisions are going to be right. Does that make sense? So somewhere on this continuum, we have to balance. And so when we think about methods, we want to have this information beforehand so we can make that decision. So does scatter matter? I looked at scatter for the KABC2, highest, lowest score, because they say 23 points, and that's significant. You should invalidate the FSIQ, could be an indicator of LD. When we do diagnostic utility stats, we can plot. So I talked about before, sensitivity versus specificity. That's really just talking about true positives versus false negatives versus true negatives versus, false negatives. And what these ROC curves do is they plot that. And this diagonal line right here, I love rock analogies. They're so easy to understand. The diagonal line is chance. That's me flipping a coin, me using the magic 8-ball. So obviously, we want our rock curve for our diagnostic sign to have as much area under the curve as possible to depart from chance. That tells us how accurate we are as a result of doing that assessment. This is if you use scatter analyses to account for LD. Okay? And this is important because it's a fundamental assumption of PSW, right? These kids have these elevations and scatter in their profile. They're weird. Basically chance. At some levels, you would be more accurate if you actually used a coin. And it doesn't matter what level you cut the scatter. 10 points, 15 points, 23 points, 30 points, okay? I'm going to focus on two metrics here. Positive predictive value and negative predictive value. Positive predictive value is derived from these efficiency statistics. It says the probability that you have the thing if you have a positive test result. That's good, right? Negative predictive value, because it's both ways. The probability you don't have the thing if you have a negative test result. We want both to be accurate, okay? Positive predictive value for scatter and LD. 5%, 5%, 4%, 4%. You have a 4 to 5% chance of being LD if you have significant scatter in your profile. No bueno. Now, on the other hand, remember there's a reciprocal relationship there. NPV is through the roof. If you have no scatter, it's very unlikely you have LD. So it is a good rule-out test, but a horrible rule-in test. And when we're using it for diagnostic decision-making, we care about the rule-in part, okay? I want you to remember this because this is a theme that we're going to see in all these studies that are actually looking more formally at PSW methods. So there's a number of assumptions that PSW has. They assume that we do RTI pre-referral, right? That's good. We want to do the third way stuff, which I always find interesting because I've been at workshops where some folks, RTI doesn't work. That's why we have to do PSW. And I'm like, you're undercutting your own model. Brad Hale says, if you don't have good RTI, you can't do PSW because you will be overwhelmed by the amount of assessment that you're going to have to do. RTI should ferret out some of those. You should not be doing 70 LD assessments a year if you're doing PSW because you can only do really 20 of these assessments really, really well. That's what they say. All the models share the same core tenets. We've talked about that before, but the primary interpretation of our cognitive tests has now moved from FSIQ to the broad ability of the index of the composite level. It's just simply a reparameterization of profile analysis. Okay? There are 3 dominant PSW models, the concordance-discordance model, the discrepancy-consistency model by Naglieri. Naglieri was actually the first one to come up with a formal PSW model. He wanted me to tell you that. In 1999, I think he's a little pissed off that Flanagan's kind of like stolen his thunder. The most popular one that I see of formal models is what I think they're calling the DDC model now. The dual discrepancy consistency, it's a Flanagan model. It's a variation based off of cross-battery assessment. It has a heavy influence on CHC. I have not seen any of the other 2 models being implemented. They're out there. They're referenced in the literature. The most common one I come across is this one. I believe your guys' is an AACPS. A lot of your documentation is not perfectly aligned with this, but it is close. All right, so how common is a cognitive weakness? This is using the WJ4. Good news, half of all kids will likely have 0 cognitive weaknesses. This is based on a multivariate normative distribution simulation. Approximately 1 in 4 kids will have at least 1 cognitive weakness. This is all the kids you're ever going to test. Over 1 in 10 will have at least 2. So, roughly speaking, 51% of every kid you're going to test is going to have at least 1 cognitive weakness. Pretty common. How common is an achievement weakness? Actually, a little bit lower. But 15% right off the bat are going to have at least 1 cognitive or 1 achievement weakness. But that's not really the question we're asking. The question is, what are the proportion of individuals with approximately average ability, right, intact abilities, that are present with a cognitive weakness? So if you look at FSIQ of 90, which is around most of our referrals for LD, those are kids who are kind of in that range, a little bit lower, there's an 85% chance that you're going to have at least one cognitive weakness. And it goes down, but it doesn't dip below 70% until you get to about 100. Same simulation, but how many kids of average ability have an achievement weakness? Again, a little bit lower, but you see it's still pretty high, exceeding 70%, right around this 90 to 95 range. So we're going to get a lot of kids that have achievement weaknesses, that have cognitive weaknesses, when we're going through and doing and looking for this confirmatory PSW patterns. The question is, in that group, do we have a mechanism for figuring out which kids have LD, which kids are just presenting with noise? All right, well, here's where the fun part starts. Stubing et al. Back in 2012. I bet many of you haven't seen this study because the PSW folks never reference this stuff. They did a simulation of all of the three major models. Okay, 5,000 cases of assessment data. They applied the model parameters to each one of the data to determine if the kid was LD or not LD. The first thing they found is, not surprisingly, there was very, very poor overlap between the models. The highest correlation was like 0.4, indicating that model choice is not arbitrary. You are to get very, very different kids depending on how you implement. Like I said, conceptually the models are the same, they just differ in terms of how they operationalize a weakness, whether they use statistical criteria or software or whatever the case may be. It's the same idea. The base rate of kids that were identified as meeting LD criteria in the models averaged between 1% and 2%. Personally, I think that's a little bit low, but I know in general, looking at the other DV studies, it is low. What does that mean? Remember that relative achievement discrepancy? If you've got an assessment model that's only going to identify a very small portion of kids, you're not going to be hitting the majority of the kids that folks on the ground at your school think have a learning problem. The ecological validity of your model is going to get questioned. And you're going to get a lot of re-referrals for kids until you eventually cave. Similar to what we found with just looking at scatter in general, excellent MPV, very, very low positive predictive value. I think it was between 3 and 9% across the different models. Brass tacks. These findings have now been replicated in every subsequent study examining the diagnostic validity of every variant of PSW method. There have now been close to a dozen empirical investigations. They've all found the same results, suggesting that a confirmatory PSW pattern is a really poor rule-in for SLD, but it is a really good rule-out for SLD. So that's a whole lot of assessment that you're doing just to figure out who doesn't have the thing. We already know the answer to that, right? Does the kid have an achievement problem? I am not aware at this point of any comparable study that has found contradictory results. Other factors that we've now identified that contribute to this problem. Why are we getting these results? Test selection. The test that you use will change the decision for the kid. If you change the achievement test alone, your overlap in the kids that are identified between the different achievement tests goes down by 30%. Okay? Here's a really interesting finding by Mikiek and colleagues. I was on a symposium with them. They said they were just like flabbergasted by it. We have this dictum of aggregating data, right? The more data we get, the more reliable our decision making is. Not so the case for PSW. It turns out the more assessment you do in PSW, the reliability coefficients go down. He's like, I have no explanation for that because it's theoretically implausible. The only thing he could provisionally come up with is there's so much error in these models that as you're doing more assessment, you're just getting compound error. So it's actually working against you. And then we have this idea of the dilution effect, right? So I hear people say all the time, like, well, we're not making a decision off the PSW. First of all, I say hogwash. It's the de facto inclusionary criteria in the model. Are you going to qualify a kid as SLD if they don't have a confirmatory PSW pattern? if you're using the model as designed, no. I hear people saying it. I know you guys in AACPS, you have some interesting stuff you guys do. But 95% of the other places in the country, no. If they don't have a confirmatory PSW pattern, we're done. Okay? So the idea is like there's no harm, right? I'm considering all these other sources. And first thing I answer is, what are those other sources? And how are you weighting those other sources? There's no guidance out there for that. Because we do have this phenomenon called the dilution effect, which is if you get non-diagnostic information, we tend to overweight it. We're just not very good at being able to sift through that stuff. And so regardless of where it's considered, it's going to have an attenuating effect on the decision utility that you make. Okay, very quickly. And I will stay after to answer questions too, so don't worry about time. Okay, why are we getting these results? PSW methods assume that we're measuring these constructs, these processing abilities well, or that we're even locating them at all. Except an independent body of factor analytic research over the last 15 years has found problems with virtually every commercial ability measure there is. Some of them are as little as we couldn't locate 1 or 2 factors. Some of them, like the WJ, are hot garbage. I'll show you the results for the WJ in a second. So the red asterisks are ones that we could not locate or were located as part of what we call a complexly determined factor. There was a fusion of abilities, and so we're like, what is that? I don't know. Okay? Ironically, the DOS2 comes out. I love the DOS2. It was my default comprehensive measure. It's a damn shame they're not going to renorm it. Okay? The SB5 is just, you try to get anything more than 1 factor out of the SB5 and the machine just tells you, please stop. So another factor is even when we can locate these dimensions, we're not measuring them very well. So Carol talked a lot about if you're going to interpret the broad ability level, you have to account for the G variance that's in there because we're not doing it at the level of the individual. All cognitive measures contain different mixtures of G, the stuff we like, and error. And when we interpret a cognitive score, like Johnny gets a visual processing score of 85, we don't tell the parent, part of this 85 is general intelligence, part of this 85 is actual visual processing, and part of this 85 is error. We can approximate the error by looking at the confidence interval, right? But we don't look at the G variance. You can do this. The results are there for you for most tests. The dark gray is the G in the KBC2 subtests. That's what's explaining test performance in these measures. The dark green is the target construct. It's what we're interested in when we're interpreting these measures. You can see that for some subtests, there's almost nothing there, fluid reasoning. And that's going to then filter into the composite scores. So we're not locating target constructs, and when we do, we're not measuring them well apart from G. There's a great quote from Coretta and Ree where they talked about, basically, when we don't account for this, we're basically giving away G's effects to the broad abilities. We're falsely ascribing them to the broad abilities when that's not the case. We've also got issues with stability of scores. Turns out that you guys account for a lot of variance. If you assess a kid at time 1 and you take on the assessment 3 years later, turns out that 25% of the variance and change in scores is just due to the examiner. So then think about the implications for PSW models where different people are testing the kids across testing intervals, right? This was an ingenious study. You have to have access to the right data to do it. Unfortunately, we haven't had access to the data to replicate it. So this comes from Bateman and Burnett, 97. Great article for those that haven't read it. This idea is we're not thinking about this stuff when we're interpreting these profiles, all these different sources of error. They said we could come up with hypotheses. We're really good at spinning a yarn. But these hypotheses, although they reduce the perception of uncertainty, they help us out. They keep us sane. They give us a mechanism for helping us to understand, or at least perceive to understand a kid's problem. When we're making these hypotheses, we're not aware of the fact that if we tested a kid 3 weeks later, we might get a completely different set of scores, and thus a completely different set of hypotheses. Okay? So this also has implications in terms of all that different variance for understanding and reliability of scores. When we think about reliability, we flip open the manual, and we look for Chromebox alpha, and we're like, 0.90 or higher, yay, we're good. Chromebox alpha is complexly determined. It doesn't make a distinction between what the test is actually measuring. So it turns out more recently we can actually separate those sorts of variance out. So we can take that G variance, we can take that target variance, and we can calculate separate reliability coefficients for them. Those are called omega coefficients. It's telling us how we're actually interpreting the test. And so with omega coefficients, we want to see coefficients exceed 0.50, so a little bit lower. This is with the KABC2. Chromebox alpha is at the end, and then omega is at the top. You can see for G, really good. MPI. Sequential processing, 0.13. Planning, remember I showed you the fluid reasoning test and they had like no variance? 0.03. Learning, 0.22. Simultaneous processing, 0.38. There's just not enough there for confident clinical decision making. We're not measuring that skill well enough. It's not a matter of those abilities aren't real. It's a matter of we're not measuring them well. Oh man, that didn't come out as much. Here's a WJ4. Here's a factor analysis, right? So we just did an EFA of the cognitive because they don't report that in the manual. So consistent with CHC theory, it suggested that the WJ4 measures 7 broad abilities. We found no evidence for that, but we decided to extract the 7-factor model anyways and see what was happening, because we always give deference to publisher theory. What happened is by the time you got to the 5th, 6th, and 7th factors, they were mathematically impermissible. There was only one subtest that would even load on them. So you can't define a factor with less than 2 indicators. But even with the factors we were able to identify, we got all this weird crap going on. Like auditory processing, working memory 1 to load together, GLR, GV, and some GF task 1 to load together. The only thing that came out clean was crystallizability and processing speed. So this model differed significantly from the CHC-inspired model, and this is a CHC reference test. When we calculated the omega coefficients, none of the factors beyond the GAI had sufficient proportion of true score variance for confident clinical interpretation. We thought, okay, sometimes when you do EFA, you get some funky results, especially with bad data, so then we did CFA. This was published in School Psych Quarterly, I think 2 years ago. So we followed up with a CFA study that was published in Archives of Scientific Psychology. This model was the best model for the data. So you get EFA and CFA colliding together, saying this is the same model, the more confidence you can have in that result. So I often get asked, but Ryan, but what about all those predictive validity studies and cognitive achievement relations? Well, it turns out when you account for that dimensional complexity, you get a very different picture of how important the broad abilities are. So when you look at incremental predictive validity, this is broad reading across the lifespan. These are broad abilities. This is from WJ3, the clinical scales, everything. GAI, everything else. Nothing contributed more than 10% additional variance beyond the full scale score. More recently, there was a meta-analysis that was done by Zabosky, Kranzler, and Gage that looked at a 20-year history of cognitive correlates predicting achievement. And what they found is that general intelligence predicted achievement really, really well across all the different studies, but very rarely did a broad ability predict more than 10% of the achievement. One of them was from one of my studies where GC predicted approximately 20% of oral language. But even with that, you have to look at contaminator predictor overlap. Then we've got the treatment utility part, the whole ATI part, right? Well, Burns et al. Did a meta-analysis of over 200 studies looking at cognitive and neuropsychological data being used to derive academic treatments, and found that beyond phonological awareness for a phonics intervention, the effects for all the other different variables were basically null. Okay? But phonological awareness phonics is really, really good. There was some inconsistency with working memory, so it wasn't all terrible. So I love this quote from Schneider and Kaufman talking about this whole ATI assumption. These are proponents of PSW, by the way. They said, after rereading dozens of papers defending such assertions, this idea we can use cognitive assessment to derive intervention, including RO, we could say that this position is mostly backed by rhetoric, in which assertions are backed by citations of other scholars, making assertions backed by citations of still other scholars, making assertions. It's just not there. We've also identified issues with the PSW software, namely, we don't have any data on base rates, diagnostic utility, where the hell they got these correlations from, what studies they cited. It's a veritable black box. Okay? And when you're making all these pairwise comparisons, you're going to raise type 1 error. In fact, Kranzler et al. Looked at the diagnostic utility of using the XBAS, and they found similar PPV and NPV values as all the other diagnostic validity studies. What was Flanagan's response? You did our study wrong. They listed conditions. I can tell you, in press right now, John said, we'll take all your guidance and we'll redo it. In press school psych review. Should be out probably summer. Replicated the exact same findings. Doing everything that Flanagan told him to do. We looked at just more generally. Forget PSW, just how well is a cognitive weakness linked to an achievement weakness? Just at a basic fundamental level. And it was much less than you would think. Here's the results with math, cut score, area. How well does it predict having an academic weakness? About 0.57 is about the highest you're going to get. So even if you accept that as positive evidence, you have to realize that when you see a cognitive weakness and an academic weakness, and you want to make that causal determination for PFW, you have to be mindful that half of the kids that had that same weakness didn't end up having an achievement problem. So how could something that is only causal half the time be the underlying reason for why that kid's struggling at school? I know of no other base rate condition where the null occurs 50% of the time. So I'll skip through some of this stuff. So they questioned, Kranzler et al. Wrote a rejoinder, they really questioned whether PSW is evidence-based. They did a search from 2001 when it was first authored in the Essentials of Cross-Battery Assessment book, and they were only able to find 2 articles in PsycInfo and the various search engines, and both of them were commentary articles. You would think if you've got all these negative studies accumulating, you'd want to kind of put out some positive data. I can only tell you that I have personally given them data sets and told them how to do this. And I haven't seen anything published yet. PSW is also really, really expensive. And the question is, given these results, would that money not be spent better elsewhere? Would our time not be spent better elsewhere? Guess what? The lawyers are starting to see this stuff. This is out of California. I got a tip on this. Never seen this before. You ready for this? School psychologists spent 18 plus hours in direct cross-examination. It had to do with her ability to defend PSW software in her decision-making. And she was initially asked by the lawyer to talk about the reliability and validity of the software. Well, of course she couldn't because those data aren't available, and it devolved from there. And so while you're told in a lot of these workshops to use your clinical judgment and use whatever score you want, that score, whatever you feel like, didn't work out well for this person. She was taking outliers out and she was trying to explain it, and it did not go well. Obviously, district lost. She said the kid didn't have PSW because the software said the kid didn't have PSW. They got an independent eval that said, nope, this kid's got PSW. I mean, this kid's got SLD. Okay. There's also a case in Texas at the district court level. I know where Alex Bojan has given expert testimony that he expects will also be similar. So this is all starting to come across. So I'll skip this. Strengths, it's intuitively appealing. We want to do this stuff. I have nothing against it, but there's a bunch of different psychometric and conceptual limitations. So what would I do? I would stop doing this. I would stop going from the instrumentation, trying to figure out what the instrumentation measures, and then fit it to this concept of SLD and hope it works. Okay? So what are some alternatives I think are promising? Hybrid models that acknowledge the limitations in our measures and don't ask us to make those high inference decisions. There's two variations that have been proposed. The first one is a dual deficit functional impairment model. Basically, does the kid have a normative deficit in achievement? And then once that's established, can you demonstrate that the kid has a functional impairment in academics? Go into the classroom and see that this kid is performing at a level where they would need special education related supports. Look at state testing results, look at grades, look at permanent products, have them do CBM, have them do whatever. So it's a normative deficit, there's a functional impairment there, this kid needs help, and then you rule out the exclusionary factors. So if you think there's a legitimate chance that this kid might have borderline or lower ability, and that's why they're struggling in school, give them a RIAS. "25 minutes, you're getting about as reliable as a full-scale IQ score as any other. Is it low, average, or better? That's not why the kid's struggling at school. That's ruled out. Is it attention? Is it behavior? Is it a sensory deficit? Rule all those things out. By the time you get through all of that, that's a comprehensive assessment. But we have no de facto inclusionary criteria or an identification model that works. So at some level, this may be the best that we can do. But if you had a model like that, think about all the time that would be saved and all the acrimony and pain and anguish of having to fit all these kids, and do they, have an arbitrary, confirmatory, statistically significant profile or not. All that's gone. But you're getting data that's directly related to intervention, right? You're seeing what that kid can do. What is their functional skill deficit? And now I can develop an intervention from that, okay? And the other one, they say rule out alternative explanatory factors. So they group things like inadequate instruction, access to English language as not exclusionary criteria, but as rival explanations for why that kid would be struggling in school. So you rule those things out too. I don't know how you do that. I was taught in grad school, you don't want to go to the table and you know what, this kid is not performing well because of inadequate instruction. Some of us have been tempted though, right? And then a dysfunction has to be present before age 18, right? You don't develop LD when you're 37 years old, okay? The other hybrid approach is Fletcher's model. The one differentiator here is they're putting more emphasis on RTI. So I would say, look, if you love yourself some RTI and that's the way you want to go, use this one. If you're like, hey, we're never going to be able to implement that with fidelity at our school, go with that one. So basically low achievement, inadequate response to instruction, and then you're ruling out the exclusionary criteria. You can fit these models to any assessment parameters. That explanation that I just gave right there, is that not giving you data to determine a kid's profile, strengths and weaknesses relative to achievement, performance, and whatnot? PSW. We don't have to use the broad ability scores to do that, okay? This kid has adequate cognitive ability. There's evidence of a functional deficit. They've got some skills in some other areas. They're low in achievement that's matching with their functional impairment. Strengths and weaknesses, okay? I'm even fine if you want to say to me, look, the experimental literature, Ryan, has shown that working memory deficits and processing speed deficits are consistently found in kids with LD. If you want to say a priori that if this kid's going to be LD, they should meet this criteria, then I should see evidence of one of those two areas as being a deficit, I'm fine with that. But that's working from a hypothetical deductive approach. That's saying a priori what I should expect to see if this kid's LD. What I don't endorse is us throwing the kitchen sink at the kid and then trying to put our Karnak hats on and then sift through the patterns and the profiles. We're going to make too many errors that way because too many kids are going to have patterns. We're going to spot something, okay? I would even be fine if you guys all put your heads together and said, if you see a basic decoding problem, this is the confirmatory pattern I should see. If I see a reading comprehension problem, this is the confirmatory pattern I should see. And then I go assess, either I see that pattern or I don't see that pattern, and my decision is final. That's a bounded concept. You're either right or wrong. I do not endorse this approach that's being advocated, just simply throw the kitchen sink at the kid and doesn't make sense, do the patterns align, okay? Although some of my colleagues disagree even with that. They're like, don't even give him that, Ryan, okay? But again, I think it would be difficult for you to do that given the fact, and I find this astonishing since these models have been around since 1999, that as of today, there has not been a single validated confirmatory pattern that has been validated as a rule-in condition for SLD. And it's not me saying that, that's Nancy Mather saying that. In 20 years, we have not developed that, which should be concerning. So strengths and limitations of these models, low inference decisions. We're not trying to get more out of what we can do with reliability, validity, and reasonable confidence. This might be the best that we can do. Takes into account test limitations, they're more ecologically valid, right? I'm going into the classroom, I'm getting academic data, that makes sense to a lot of people. Cost effective, reduces the test burden. And I think the question we have to ask is something Shapiro said a long time ago. We can like this stuff, that's fine, but is it really helping us solve the big problems in school psychology? All this time that we're spending doing all this assessment, what's the net effect in our schools? Can kids read better? Have we solved tier 1 problems? School-based mental health. I don't know about you, but I'm observing that's getting worse. Where are we going to lead? We've got to have the time to be able to do that stuff, okay? Limitations, some people are going to find these dissatisfactory because there's no inclusionary criteria. I'm dissatisfied by that too, but again, I don't know what that would be. There's also the perception that this is a simple approach, and simple we don't like because it doesn't make us feel like master detectives, okay? But this is actually really hard stuff. There's also the perception of an existential threat of if I'm not allowed to do all this profile analysis stuff, then I've lost my sense of identity about what it means to be a school psychologist. Okay? I get that. I was in your shoes. When I came across this research and I was like, that was my red pill moment, I was like, all right, I'm going to do this. But then I realized I didn't know a whole lot. I had lost all my training. I was taught to do assessment. That's it. So I'm not going to minimize that for those of you that are confronted with that. But I guarantee you, if you step out and you do different things and you take that leap, you will be rewarded more than you've ever been in your career tenfold. You might work harder, you might work more hours, but you'll be rewarded tenfold. I've never got as much professional satisfaction as I did sitting down, assessing kids, and working with them one-on-one than I ever did giving the cognitive tests. Okay? The last thing I'll leave you with, and then for those of you that have to leave and stuff, I'll stay for questions. I realize that there are places where you don't have a choice about what you do. I worked in a district like that too. I had the discrepancy model despite all the things we knew about that, right? But there are implications for informed consent. So some of you do not have a choice about what you do. You're going to do PSW and you don't have a choice about that. So I have to get asked, what do I do in that situation, Ryan? My advice is to do what I did and adopt a black box morning reports. I did this for the last 3 years of my career. And there was very rarely a meeting that I was at that didn't have a lawyer or more than one lawyer in it. You know how many questions I got about this, by the way? Not one. And when I get a parent that would ask me about some kind of profile analysis, what does this mean? I would say the only thing I could say with certainty, I don't know. You know any follow-up questions I got after that? None. That way I could say, look, I don't have a choice in this. I don't make policy. But at least the people who read my assessment reports, I'm being as intellectually honest as I can. I'm fulfilling my ethical mandate. You can look at this stuff and do whatever you want with it, but here's a limitation, so we have to take that into consideration. Okay? And maybe that's all you can do in some circles. That, to me, would be a major step forward for the field, if we were actually being honest with consumers about known limitations with our tools.